like answering the question, what's the value of physics or what's the value of chemistry? Well, it's about finding out stuff about physical stuff and chemical stuff. And in the case of philosophy, about whatever we're talking about. In my case, finding out stuff about, evidence and defeat and justification. And these are important things. I mean, we started off by saying that this entire philosophical book, which is quite boring and abstract at the end of it, was motivated by a very serious social phenomenon.
So welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Mona Simion. She is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Glasgow, where she's also Deputy Director of the COGITO Epistemology Research Centre. Her work focuses on a range of topics, including epistemology, ethics, language, and feminist philosophy. Her books include Shifty Speech and Independent Thought, Epistemic Normativity and Context, and Sharing Knowledge, A Functionalist Kind of Assertion, and her new book that we'll be focusing on today, which is called Resistance to Evidence. She also has a variety of published articles on these topics. Feel free to add anything, but welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Simion.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. That about sums it up, indeed. It's good to be here.
Great. Yeah, so as I said in the introduction, we're going to focus on your new book, Resistance to Evidence. As of recording, it's not available yet, but it should be, I think you said sometime in March it's expected to be published.
Yeah, that's right. Towards the end of March. That's what Cambridge advertised at any rate.
All right, fair enough. So I'll update the video description with links to that on to Amazon or Cambridge whenever that's available. So yeah, so just before getting into the book, like generally speaking, what are like some of the primary aims in this book, and what can people interested in epistemology expect to get out of it?
Yeah, so one very funny thing about this book is that it has a very weird genealogy, in that normally when you work on very theoretical philosophy like epistemology and so on, you're mostly trained to care about solving very abstract puzzles, right? And you really care about those puzzles, you try to solve them, you offer your own solution, and that's very satisfactory. And for the purpose of what we're being trained to do in theoretical philosophy, that may well be the end of the road. Now, of course, there's a lot of pressure on philosophers, and that I think is pressure that we should have on us, to think about the societal relevance of our work very often. So what happens when that is the case is that after we solve our very abstract philosophical puzzles, we start thinking about the social consequences that our results might have. Now, in the case of this book, however, the way it worked was the other way around. So I started being interested in a puzzle that has to do with the way in which epistemic phenomena work in society. And this kind of social epistemic puzzle got me thinking about the more abstract stuff. So in particular, the puzzle that I'm talking about has to do with the fact that even though we have all these increasingly sophisticated ways of sharing and generating knowledge with all kinds of AI tools and so on, it seems as though we are facing an unprecedented ignorance crisis that's affecting our democracies and in general our social well-being. And that, interestingly, the World Health Organization has deemed an infodemic. So this tells you a little bit about how unprecedented the ignorance crisis is, at the same time, with an unprecedented advance in knowledge sharing technologies, right? So that's a funny situation. And it's not only puzzling because of this, but it's also puzzling because it seems to be triggered by two, in a way, contradictory type of behaviors, in that one way in which this ignorance crisis is triggered is via gullibility, right? So people accepting disinformation from unreliable sources to a very large extent. And you might think, well, if it's gullibility, let's solve gullibility. Let's train people, maybe build our education systems in a way in which they're a bit more cautious with accepting all kind of messages that they read on the internet. But at the same time, what we get in the population is a very, very high levels of distrust in scientific expertise, right? So that seems to be to the contrary, that people are not too gullible, but rather too skeptical. So the question then is, what is the underlying cause of this puzzling phenomenon? So then when I started thinking about this, I thought, okay, so we need an epistemological theory that comes and explains what is going on. And here's one thing that this theory better not say. It better not say that we all of a sudden have started experiencing widespread irrationality, right? That as soon as the internet raised, we all became crazy. Our cognitive systems just went off rails just because we got the internet, because that's an implausible hypothesis, right? We are a highly successful species. We go to work every day successfully, avoid obstacles, produce food, stay away from predators, all kind of things that we do successfully because we are well-oiled cognitive machines, right? So basically, ideally, you want to explain all this data without having to appeal to, a sudden boost in irrationality. So that's what motivated basically the epistemological concern. And my hypothesis was that what is going on is that basically this environment that the internet has generated is a weird epistemic environment for us. It's too rich both in terms of quantity of information, but also in terms of how diverse it is, right? We have a diversity of sources that we didn't use to experience, sources that we don't meet with in real life. So we don't, we're not very good at figuring out whether they're reliable or not because we can't track any signs of deception or anything like that. We don't have a relationship with these people. So my hypothesis before writing this book was that what we're experiencing is an abrupt change in our information environment, which makes it such that we are basically not inhabiting normal conditions, the conditions in which our cognitive system has evolved. And that because our cognitive system is now inhabiting an abnormal epistemic environment, it's failing in two ways. It's either failing in that even though it's properly functioning, it doesn't generate knowledge anymore because of this rubbish environment, or it has instances of malfunction because it just doesn't know how to handle this amount of information. So that was the hypothesis behind the book.
Yeah, very good. And so when it comes to resistance to evidence in particular, I mean, you bring up a bunch of examples just to kind of introduce the topic, like, being resistant to scientific expertise on things like climate change or vaccines, or, resisting somebody's testimony, even when it's reasonable testimony, either because, I don't know, you're just dismissing it for some reason, or it's like racially or gender motivated discrimination or something else like that. There's plenty of different cases like this that you talk about. I mean, do you see this as maybe you could talk about a couple more examples or and how significant of an issue this is in everyday kind of epistemology?
Yeah, so I think that epistemologically, one of the main contributions of the book is that it unifies this phenomenon of evidence resistance in that, some of these cases have been discussed before in the literature. So, of course, notably, Miranda Fricker discusses cases of epistemic injustice, and people in perception have discussed cases of cognitive penetration, so cases in which basically your perception, for instance, of someone's face is such that it expresses anger, even though that person is very kindly smiling at you, just because your perception is penetrated by your racial bias or something like that. All right. So these are cases that have been discussed in isolation before, and people have tried to give an account of what's going on in that particular case. But one of the main contributions of the book is saying, no, actually, wait a minute. All of these cases in which we dismiss testimony because of racial and gender bias, cases in which we don't trust experts on very well-established scientific claims, such as anthropogenic climate change or vaccine safety. Cases in which we look straight at the table and we just don't believe it's there because we are, not paying attention and so on. So all of these cases involve different sources of knowledge. It's testimony, it's perception. You can even bring cases of inference and so on. Some cases are cases of failures in inquiry, in that you're a detective and, you just refuse that your body committed the crime. You refuse to believe that your body committed the crime because he's your body and you just don't want to believe that about your friends, even though you have all the evidence. So all of this, I want to say, are cases that have been discussed under different umbrellas in the relevant literatures on testimony, on perception, on inquiry, and so on. But one main finding of the book is, no, wait a minute, all of these cases display the same kind of failure if you go at a higher abstract level, which is a failure to update in light of evidence. So it's a case of resistance to evidence, whether it's testimonial evidence or it's perceptual or inferential, whatever evidence it is, and whether it is generated by bias, be it hot bias, so like racist or sexist bias, or just cold, boring biases like confirmation bias, for instance. Whatever is the trigger, what's important is there is the same kind of failure. And that's important for theorizing, to know there is the same kind of failure, because we do philosophy, we don't do sociology. So in a way, it's not our job to talk about the triggers. That's something that you need empirical investigation to figure out what the triggers are. Our job is to figure out what the phenomenon is, what the nature of it is, in order to then figure out what the norms that are, problematically breached at the context are.
Good. Yeah, and I was thinking like there potentially are some upshots of having a kind of unified account too, right? And that like potentially you could have a more unified solution or response to it. What do you think about that? Or the benefits of having a kind of unified account about resistance?
Yeah, so I think this affords a two-legged response. So one is for policy and practice. I think it's very important that we have a unified account that is able to distinguish between uh, evidence resistance proper. And when I say resistance, I use it in a negatively valenced way. So when you're resistant to evidence, you have evidence that you should update by, and you fail to do so. But as opposed to that, there's also the benign phenomenon of evidence, of mere evidence rejection, which is perfectly fine. We do it all the time. We reject evidence because it is defeated, for instance, right? So we reject testimony from unreliable speakers because we know that they're unreliable, and that's perfectly fine, right? That is so. The book distinguishes between these two phenomena, and for policy and practice, obviously, it's very important to distinguish between these two phenomena, because if we discover that a particular community, for instance, rejects the evidence about the safety of vaccines, for instance, because they're evidence resistant. So there is some bias going on there. So it's some variety of irrationality is at stake. Then we know that we need to intervene on the individuals. So we need to fix the individual cognizer, right? But if that's not the case, if it is a mere case of evidence rejection, it can happen, right? So it may be that you inhabit an environment that's filled with misleading evidence against the safety of vaccines, right? Misleading evidence is evidence, right? So if you inhabit an environment where everybody tells you vaccines are not safe, stay away, you are, by any account of testimony, perfectly justified not to take that vaccine, right? So that is a case in which you're doing everything well, epistemically. You're just rejecting evidence, you're not resisting it. The problem is with the environment, that the evidence in question is misleading, right? And in that case, the intervention that this kind of case affords is an intervention on the environment, because that's where the problem lies. So for policy and practice, it's really important to have a unified account of evidence resistance, and also to distinguish it very neatly from just the benign cousin, which is just, garden variety evidence rejection for good reason, as it were. Now, epistemologically, why that's interesting epistemologically is for a couple of reasons. So one is that for the longest time, very strangely, by my lights, in philosophy, we thought that having evidence has to do with somehow putting it in your head. So somehow getting it within your skull. So philosophers don't agree on many things, but if you look in the history of accounts of what it is for someone to have evidence, internalists and externalists, to a very large extent, agree that this having relation, the having of evidence, has to do with taking it out from the world and putting it in your head. So if you're an internalist, for instance, you think that you have evidence when you have the relevant experience, perceptual experience, for instance, right? So I have evidence that there's a computer in front of me right now because I have a perceptual experience as though there is a computer in front of me right now. That's why I have evidence. So it's in my head. The experience is what does the evidential support, the having relation of the evidence, right? If you're an externalist, so for instance, Williamson thinks that your evidence is your knowledge, right? So you have a piece of evidence when you know it. So of course, knowledge implies belief. So then it's got to be in our head again in order to have it. So why is that important? Well, because notice that if you think in this way about evidence, it's very hard to resist it. The phenomenon itself, you can't have it on a priori grounds, because once you've already taken it up, right? So the only kind of bit of resistance that you can account for is the bit where you do take up the evidence, but you fail to update properly. So that's the bit that people who think that evidence is in the head, as it were, can explain, right? Because you've taken this up, but you don't update your belief in accordance to what it suggests, right? So they can explain that, but what they can't explain is failure of update. So when I hear you saying something and I don't even bother to take it up because I don't form any belief, or like the case of the detective earlier, right, that we were mentioning. So I see my friend doing it in front of me, but I refuse to believe it because I can't believe he would do such a thing. So now if I don't believe it, I don't know it. So by Williamson's lies, I have no evidence that he did it, right? So this way of thinking about evidence makes it very hard to account for what's going wrong in cases of resistance to evidence. So what was epistemologically very interesting for me about these cases is that they motivate a complete shift in the way in which we think about the having relation, that moves the having relation outside the skull, in that On my account, what it is to have evidence is to be in a position to know it. So to be in a position where you can easily take it up, basically. So when you tell me that it's raining outside, whether I decide to take up this information and handle it well and update or not, it makes no difference to whether I have this evidence. As soon as you told me that it's raining, I have evidence that it's raining. And that's what my account predicts. And I want you to notice that, no, interestingly, I think that that's also the folk conception of evidence. So I think that, honestly, if I go to my grandma and I tell her I have no evidence that there's a computer on this table because I refuse to believe it, she's going to find that very strange.
Yeah. No, that's very good. I was wondering, like, what if Williamson or someone else who took a view along these lines were to say something like, just kind of bite the bullet and say, no, okay, you really don't have evidence, although you might still be doing something inappropriate by not, I don't know, taking up evidence that maybe you should take up or something like that. And that's where the failure is.
Yeah, and in the book I look at a bunch of ways of doing it in that way. So Tim Williamson, indeed, in conversation, suggested that maybe the way he would go would be to say, well, in this case, you are blameworthy as a cognizer. And why are you blameworthy? Because you're not doing something that a good epistemic agent would do. So a good epistemic agent would have this evidence. A good epistemic agent would take up this information and believe it. So then they would have this evidence. You don't have it, but you're blameworthy for not having it because you should have had it, because a good epistemic agent would have had it, right? So that's I think, a pretty story and a plausible one. The worry that I have with it has to do, I have many worries with it, but I guess the most important worry that I have with it has to do with one-off cases. So cases in which you are a good epistemic agent, you do have good epistemic dispositions. It's just a one-off failure, right? And if it's a one-off failure, you are doing what a good epistemic agent would do, because you're doing what you would do, and you are a good epistemic agent, right? So we can't ask for good epistemic agents to be infallible. Or we can ask is that they have reliable dispositions to do well. So that implies that they're going to fail on occasion, right? That's what reliable but not infallible people do. They fail on occasion. It's predicted by the reliability, but lack of infallibility thereof. So when you have a reliable disposition to do things well epistemically, by any account, including Williamson's, it follows that you are a good epistemic agent. You have a good epistemic disposition. But of course, you're going to fail on occasion. And that is going to be a case in which we want to say, well, you're resisting evidence. So even though you're great in other walks of life, on this particular occasion, when you don't believe this woman, you're doing something wrong. You should have believed her. And we want to be able to explain what you're doing wrong. But we can't explain it in terms of you missing the good disposition, because by stipulation you have it. You can't explain in terms of you not doing what someone with a good disposition would do, because you are doing what someone with a good disposition would do, i.e. what you would do, because you are someone with a good disposition. So it's very hard to understand, if you want to put it in this kind of dispositionalist terms, what is going wrong with one-off failures. And I think that that's interesting, because that's a problem for virtue epistemologists as well, because they also talk in terms of dispositions, even though they have a completely different view, right? So there are many C's between your standard knowledge firster and your standard virtue epistemologist, with, of course, a few interesting views in the literature that try to combine these views. But if you go, from Tim to Ernie Sosa, and you discover that they have exactly the same problem, in that they try to account for this failure in terms of disposition, I think that that's an interesting problem, really.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what if someone tried, either in the knowledge first camp or in a virtue camp, tried to say that it's not that you should do what like a good agent would do, but maybe put it in terms of like what an ideal epistemic agent would do, or someone with like perfect epistemic virtue. And so even the smallest failure is still some failure. And then we could talk about maybe how good you are in terms of how close you are to that ideal, something like that.
Yeah, so that's an interesting view that nobody has defended, because people tend to stay away from, saying that you should do what the ideal agent should. So the worry that I have with that way of going epistemologically is very roughly an ought implies can type of worry. So we are, so I don't think the ought implies can principle is correct. I'm one of the people who think it's not, and I'm not alone in this boat. So usually in ethics, very few people who think that what implies can is correct. There's been mountains of literature on why it fails. In epistemology, sometimes people take it for granted because it's not our specialist. I'm not one of these people, so I don't think what implies can is correct. For instance, take the case of the sexist. There's a sense in which the sexist can't take up women's testimony because he's a sexist. He just can't believe what they're saying. But it doesn't really follow that he ought not, right? And this kind of case in epistemology just follows straight on the back of the kind of cases that had been put forth in ethics to argue against the ought implies can principle. But here is, I think, a principle, a restricted version of this principle that I think is closer to the truth. I don't think it's true. I think that it has problems, and we can talk about this if you're interested. But I think it's closer to the truth, in that ought implies that someone like a species typical cognizer like you can. So epistemic ought implies a species typical cognizer can. So basically, let's go back to the sexist. There's a sense in which the sexist can't believe the woman himself because he's a sexist. But someone like him, a species typical cognizer like him, like an adult cognizer with his cognitive architecture, surely can take up testimony from women, right? So in that way, you can explain why he ought to take it up, even though he personally can't because he's a biased cognizer, right? Now, again, I think this restricted version of the principle comes with some problems. Which is why I never, wrote a paper about defending this principle. But I think it's closer to the truth, and for our purposes in this book, enough to do the job. So that's why, and this principle, I think, is right, because one thing that you don't want to say is that I should, because I know all Peano axioms, that I should now believe all arithmetical truths because they follow from it. You know what I mean? So am I resistant to evidence because I don't believe all these arithmetical truths now? I want to say, well, I just can't. The kind of cognizer that I am, I'm sorry, is really not able to believe, the first thing about this arithmetical truths that are implied by Peano axioms. So, we're faced with a dilemma. If we're going to say you should do what the ideal person does, we end up asking too much of the cognizer. We end up predicting that I'm resistant to evidence because I don't have all these beliefs about fancy arithmetical truths. If we want to say you just need to have a reliable epistemical disposition, we end up asking too little of the cognizer, because then someone with a reliable epistemic disposition turns out not to do anything wrong in this one of instances of failures, but we still want to say that something wrong went on there. So this is kind of the dilemma that we're faced with. And I guess the way in which I try to squeeze in between these horns is by saying, look, what you ought to do is what the species typical cognizer is able to do. So, is the species typical cognizer able to take up testimony from women and, expert testimony about climate change and, the fact that there's a computer in front of me? Yes, they are. So then I should take up this evidence. That's roughly the thought.
Yeah, good. I mean, as soon as I asked the question, I was reminded of, because I had Eric Sampson on a year ago or so, and we talked about the problems for kind of like an ideal counterpart theory just in regular ethics. And like some of the stuff you said there reminded me of that. It's like, well, I mean, I was thinking like the ideal counterpart, maybe their beliefs would be closed under entailment, but why would we expect that to be true of us? They might have different interests regarding inquiry. Why would we expect that to map onto us? Like, they might have different kind of normative rankings of things, and like, why would we have the same? So like, and why would we expect us that we should do all the things that they have done or are able to do? It's like,
yeah, I mean, so here's a charitable way to think. So a lot of this ideal agent work is done in formal epistemology, in probabilism, and I like this work. But here is a more charitable way to think about what this work is doing. I don't think the charitable way is working, but here's a more charitable way. So one way that is basically just utilitarianism, I think, from ethics, is to say, look, here's the ideal cognizer. We're going to tell you how the ideal looks. And then what do you need to do as the non-ideal person that you are? Well, just approximate the ideal cognizer as much as you can. And then we can rank you and your buddies according to how well you approximate the ideal cognizer. So our framework is going to be useful in predicting things about everyday people as well, because they're going to tell us who's doing better, because we can just, kind of compare them to the ideal cognizer. And if that were true, I would agree. Because, for instance, I agree with it in ethics with utilitarianism, that's true. So I agree that, if you give more money to charity than I do, you're just a better moral agent. How do we know that? Well, because the ideal moral agent gives all their money to charity. And, we are limited creatures. We're not going to do that. But the more we do it, the better we are. So I think that's nice. It's a nice framework. I don't think it works in epistemology, but I think it doesn't work because of the details of the view rather than because of the general thought that I just expressed. So, for instance, people who like this ideal kind of formal views, they think coherence is very important, right? So they think that the ideal agent should have fully coherent beliefs, and any breach in coherence is going to be problematic. So, of course, as soon as you have that view, you're going to be hard-pressed to say, for instance, that the fully coherent Nazi is a better epistemic agent than I am, because I surely have a couple of incoherences somewhere in my cognitive system. While, the Nazi has all these false beliefs about the world, but they sit nice and tightly with each other. And I want to say, if your epistemology predicts that the fully coherent Nazi is in any way better than I am, you need to go back to the drawing board, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a question to be asked as to whether we should even approximate the ideal cognizer in terms of full coherence. It seems to me as though between two Nazis, one that has one incoherent belief that is true, right, and the other one that has a fully coherent system of false beliefs, I strongly prefer this one with one true belief, even though he displays less coherence. So that's why I'm a bit skeptical about even the thought that by doing all of this nice coherent stuff, you're at least approximating to the ideal agent. But you can see how that's not a problem for the theory itself. It's more a problem for the details in the way in which it is spelled out.
Right. Yeah. And if we're putting it in terms of like an ideal counterpart, like, okay, if we have certain incoherence, like maybe views and tension, sometimes we contradict ourselves, and presumably an ideal counterpart wouldn't, in which way would they not, right? Because there's different ways that you might reconcile contradictory beliefs in us. But
Yeah,
are we assuming that there's a unique best way to do that,
Yeah. Coherence doesn't tell you which of the incoherent beliefs you need to drop, right? It just tells you that one needs to go. That's why we need more in our epistemology than coherence, because we need someone to tell us, well, try not to drop the true and justified one. You're not better off by becoming coherent if in the process you will have dropped the true and justified belief and kept the false and unjustified one. And that, bringing us back to resistance to evidence, very often when it happens in virtue of doxastic defeat, as a matter of fact. So when it happens, when it is proper resistance to evidence, or the problematic part of it, not the just evidence rejection, when you already have these entrenched beliefs that are unjustified, you don't remember that they're unjustified because you acquired them. Maybe, they're this childhood biases. I don't know, your racist grandfather told you make sure not to play with the dark kids, they're dangerous, or some other horrible thing. And maybe you don't believe that outright anymore, but some little beliefs are still left there because it's hard to get rid of your childhood beliefs, right? So this kind of, and when you have these beliefs that are unjustified, but you have them, is really hard when you have something, incoming information that contradicts them. It's really hard to know which one to drop. And here is why. So even the best of us can make a mistake then, to know whether you should reject the incoming information or drop the extant belief. Why can we make a mistake? Precisely because we don't remember how we came to believe this thing. So most of us don't remember the justification that we have for our beliefs. I have no idea how I came to believe my name is Mona. Honestly, I don't. I have no idea how I came to believe most of the things about geography that I believe in the world. I conjecture it's got to be my geography teacher in combination with Discovery Channel, but I don't really know how I came to believe, I don't know, that Paris is the capital of France. None of us remember that. And because of this, it may well be hard to track beliefs that are well entrenched but are actually unjustified. Because just like I don't remember how I came to believe that Paris is the capital of France, I might not remember how I came to believe things that I believe unjustifiably, right? And then it's really hard to figure out, what do I drop? Do I drop this incoming information, or do I drop my entrenched belief? Because it's not like I can compare the evidence for and against, because the evidence for my entrenched belief is not there anymore. I don't remember what it is. So it's a hard thing. So that's why I conjecture. But again, this is sociology from the armchair when I say this. But I really think that many of this resistance to evidence instances that look weird are actually generated by a perfectly natural phenomenon that has to do indeed with us trying to stay coherent. and not knowing what to drop, the belief that we already hold or the information that's coming in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was wondering so a couple ways I want to go here before I get into some of your way you try to the account you provide. Are there some cases where it's resistance to evidence of the inappropriate kind, but like the person isn't necessarily blameworthy because I don't know they don't know which of the beliefs they maybe developed in an unreliable way. You know, they're just doing the best they can with what they have. Maybe they're not really blameworthy for that. I don't know. What do you think about this?
Yeah, so I am someone who thinks that there's a huge distinction between justification and blameworthiness. And since I unpack justification partially in terms of evidence, of course, I'm going to think that there's going to be a gap between evidence resistance and blameworthiness. You can be blamelessly evidence resistant. It's still a cognitive malfunction, but it's a blameless one. And one case is this kind of stuff, right? Where you have these beliefs that you are holding, you don't remember why you're holding, you don't really have evidence that you can access that has to do with how you form these beliefs, and then there's this incoming information, and you just don't know how to go about it, right? I mean, of course, the more incoming information suggests that your belief is false, the more justified you are to drop it. But the first time when you have some contradictory information to your belief, you might be kind of um, not knowing what to do, just weighing pros and against. And of course, de facto, you're not justified to hold that belief. So what you should do de facto is drop it. But from your cognizer's perspective, it's hard to figure that out, right? So I think that in line with Alexander Bird, I will say this: I think that the stuff that we're blameworthy for is the stuff that can be laid at the door of the cognizer. And I think that given that we're fallible creatures, some failures just can't be laid at our door because we are just failing in blameless ways, right? So I think a lot of that stuff can happen in this. A lot of this kind of resistance to evidence can happen in this blameless fashion. So I guess what I do want to say is that we shouldn't. So here's one thing that I'm not keen to say. I'm not keen to say that when you see this kind of vast, kind of scientific evidence resistance in some geographical areas that I'm not going to mention because it's not nice to talk about people in such precise ways. But when you see this kind of, huge blocks of geography that don't believe that climate change is happening, right? So what I want to say is it's easy for us to think, because there are peers, right? They're people, and it's easy for us to think maybe they're blameless. Maybe there's something that's doing this to them, right? Because how has half of this continent become, scientific evidence resistant? And I want to say, let's not rush there. So, it is true that if here's a case in which it's clearly true that you're blamelessly not taking up scientific expertise, right? You are hit over the head, and that's why you're not taking that. That's blameless. You're hit over the head, so now you're, literally malfunction because of physical reasons. So that's why you're not taking up this information. Or, you, for instance, I don't know, you miscalculate something. You have a bunch of testimony from scientists and a bunch of testimony from your priest and whatever, which, you don't know that they don't know what they're talking about. You're justified to believe whatever they're saying because they proved themselves to be reliable in the past. So now you need to weigh this evidence. And, sometimes it's hard to weigh it because it's not a very precise thing. We can talk in precise probabilistic ways in philosophy, but when it comes to actually weighing it in real life, it's not trivial. So you might get it wrong and start disbelieving the scientific testimony when in fact the evidence weighs the other way around. So this can happen. But let's not go as far as to think that half a continent is doing that, right? So here is my favorite example to use to see why it's kind of a gradual thing, this blamelessness that can be involved in evidence resistance. So my favorite example is my grandfather. Unfortunately, he passed away recently, so it's a sad example for me, but I think it's a very illuminating one, so I'm going to keep talking about him, and he's going to stay alive in that way. So my grandfather, I grew up in my early childhood was behind the Iron Curtain in communist Romania, and my grandfather spent 45 years of his life behind the Iron Curtain in communist Romania. So what used to happen behind the Iron Curtain is complete cutoff from information. So nothing was coming in from the capitalist problematic part of society. With the result that we were completely depleted of information for 45 years. We had no information sources, which of course, my grandfather didn't quite like the regime, and he was in the resistance, so he wasn't buying into many of the things that the regime was saying politically and so on. But at the end of the day, when you only have 2 hours of TV news a day and it's all controlled by the dictator, at some point you need to take your information from somewhere. So if the news says it's going to rain tomorrow, you need to believe it, right? So there are going to be topics in which you're not going to know whether to believe or not what you're being told. So one of these topics was, for instance, so of course the communist regime was very keen to say bad things about the US because that was the main capitalist, as it were, enemy that they were fighting and that they were trying to convince the population to reject as a way of life, right? So one way in which they did it was by trying to piggyback on racial bias. So they would come and say, look, these capitalists, they're completely nuts. America is heavily populated with black people, and black people are very dangerous. So it's good for us that the party protects us here, and people can't easily go out and in because we are protected from this invasion of black people that has happened in the capitalist countries. So this kind of information was something that my grandfather should have rejected. But piggybacking on all of the biases that we all have, and added to the fact that my grandfather has never in his life seen a black person. There was literally never has he seen a black person. So he had no personal experience with these people. It was, this kind of the other, right, as continental philosophers put it. So my grandfather, basically, in a nutshell, was a horrible racist for 45 years. And not a very active one, because there were no black people for him to discriminate against actively. But if asked, he would speak in extremely racist ways. So what I want to say is, I'm not sure what the correct account of blame is, and I'm not someone that's comfortable saying, for instance, that slave owners were the product of their time and they were blameless. But what I want to say is that after the Iron Curtain fell, my grandfather didn't change his beliefs, even though his information environment changed completely, right? So within the whatever years that passed, almost 35 years now since the Iron Curtain fell, his information environment was flooded with proper information on this topic. Nevertheless, his belief didn't move an inch. So he remained a very hardcore racist from the beginning till end. Now, what I want to say about my grandfather is, whatever your view of blamelessness is, here is something that it should predict, that he was more blameless in the beginning than he was at the end, right? Because his environment made it such that he could have changed, updated his belief after the Iron Curtain fell, in a way in which it would have been much harder before the Iron Curtain fell. There are these people in the literature who think that when it comes to moral matters, we have some sort of a priori access to it, that he could have thought for himself and figured out that there's absolutely no reason to believe that particular people, just because they are of a particular color, they display other, properties such as dangerousness and so on. So he could have maybe thought in this way. That's why I'm not comfortable to say he was completely blameless behind the Iron Curtain, but he was definitely more blameless than he was after the Iron Curtain fell and Romania was flooded with information. So I think when it comes to, basically, to keep a long story short, when it comes to diagnosing the population, we shouldn't rush into saying, well, yes, they're resistant to evidence, but maybe they're blameless because, their environment is complicated. Look, my grandfather literally was behind the Iron Curtain. It's really hard to imagine in our day and age, with our information spreading capacities, someone who is as informationally deprived as my grandfather was, living, I don't know, in a village in Scotland. So, of course, if you live in a village in Scotland, you're more informationally deprived than if you live in Glasgow. But it's a question of degree, right? So I'm hesitant to say that we're going to encounter a lot of blameless evidence resistance in the population, given how dense our information environment is.
No, that's a good illustration. Wow. Yeah, I could see someone wanting to support like a stronger connection maybe between like epistemic failures and epistemic blameworthiness. Like you might think like, well, if it's an epistemic failure is a normative notion. It's like something you should have done, or something you shouldn't have done. And if you did something you shouldn't have done, at least to some degree, you're blameworthy for that. I mean, do you see the connection that someone might want to draw there, or do you think?
Yeah, so I think that there are a bunch of people that have wanted to draw this connection. I'm hesitant to draw a stronger one on mere theoretical grounds. So this distinction between basically justification and blamelessness has been a distinction that's been around for 2,000 years since Aristotle. So on grounds of prior plausibility, I would like, all the work that has been done for 2,000 years that supports this distinction to be done to deny it before I agree with the view that collapses these two categories, basically. So whenever I want to say, whenever someone collapses justification and blamelessness, I worry about prior plausibility, given that this distinction, the fact that you can be blamelessly unjustified and blameworthily unjustified. So this distinction has been around for 2,000 years and has been put to very good work in ethics and has been there for a good reason. So if your theory conflicts with it, I want to say, well, maybe you're right. Maybe we've been wrong in ethics for 2,000 years, but I want to hear more evidence on grounds of prior plausibility, basically.
Yeah, fair enough. And then just another kind of general concern. It's something that it's a concern that I often have in like a lot of areas in philosophy, which is that like when we're talking about evidence, talking about knowledge, we're trying to theorize about them in kind of rigorous ways. I have this general worry that like, I mean, our normal concepts, our normal maybe thought and talk and practices relating to epistemic matters, it's kind of messy. Often it's kind of variable, maybe imprecise. And I'm a little worried that if we're looking to give a rigorous account of what we're normally talking about, well, maybe that's not really available because it's just kind of messy and variable. I don't know. I mean, what do you make of this worry? Is it something that like comes up for you and
Yes.
thinking about these matters? Or
Yeah, it does. So here's how it comes up for me. So on my view, so it's important to figure out, as I already said, in order to figure out when you're resistant to evidence, it's important to figure out when you have it. Because if you don't have it, you can't be resistant to it. You're in the clear. It might be that you should have had it and that you're displaying a failure of inquiry. And I discuss failures of inquiries in my book and try to give an account of that. But if we're only talking about evidence resistance in terms of a failure to respond to evidence that you have, we first need to understand when is it that you have it, right? So on my view, so when it comes to evidence, if you put forth an account of evidence, you need to account for two relations. You need to account for the evidential relation, so the epistemic support relation. What is the support between the piece of evidence and the proposition that it supports? And on my view, that is my view follows Tim Williamson in saying that has to do with evidential probabilities. So a piece of evidence supports a proposition insofar as it raises the cognizer's evidential probability that proposition is true. So that's the epistemic support relation. And then there's the having relation. When is it that I have this piece of evidence rather than not? And that I spell out in terms of being in a position to know. So now this being in a position to know thing is also a notion that has been used in epistemology a lot, a bit sloppily. And we actually don't have a lot of positive accounts of what being in a position to know even is. So if you're going to put forth an account in terms of being in a position to know, the next thing that happens, the work is never done. The next thing that happens is you need to tell us what you mean by that, because it's easy to say it and leave it out there unexplained. So explicating the notion tends to run into this kind of trouble that you discuss. So here is how. First of all, it looks as though sometimes we use this locution, being in a position to know, to mean things that I can literally just take up. So if I believe it, I know it, right? So all the information is lying right in front of me. All I have to do is believe it. So sometimes we use it in that way. Sometimes we use it in a looser way, whereby we will say things like, Mona is in a position to know what the schedule of the football tournament is. When what is meant is not that I'm looking straight at it right now, but that if I want to, I can just check it on Google, right? Or Mona is in a position to know what Adam is doing next door, when what is meant is not that I can see through the wall, but that I can walk and check out what Adam is doing. So this is very important epistemologically, this ambiguity. We have it in everyday speech because it doesn't matter much in everyday speech. But epistemologically, it matters a lot, because if I am in a position to know in the first sense something, then I should update on it, right? So if it's lying right in front of me, I should update my beliefs on it. I have no obligation to update on whatever Adam is doing right now in the next room because I can't see through the wall, right? It might be that I have some inquiry obligations, depending what inquiring I'm engaging in, to go and check it out. But I definitely don't have an obligation to believe whatever he's doing right now because I can't see through the wall. So as it turns out, if you're going to think that being in a position to know has something to do, some grounding work to do with epistemic obligations is really important. to not use the messy notion that's used every day, but to explicate it. So what I do in the book is basically explications. It's conceptual engineering by saying, look, the way in which I'm going to use these terms is as follows. I'm going to use being in a position to know for stuff that you can just take up without doing anything, is lying right in front of you, and being in a position to come to know for stuff that you still need to do a bit of work for. Well, the work can be, a lot of work, from, going and checking in a library, to quite little work. Maybe all that's needed is to open your eyes. If I close my eyes right now, by these explicated notions, the way I use them in the book, if I close my eyes, I'm not in a position to know that there's a computer in front of me. I'm in a position to come to know it by opening my eyes. So that's kind of the way in which I precisify. This is just one example. Another example has to do with the grandfather example that I was giving you earlier. Of course, it is intuitive that what's happening in that grandfather example is that my grandfather is getting worse and worse. He's on a spectrum, right? In terms of blameworthiness. He's really better off, deep behind the Iron Curtain, and really worse off a couple of years ago, right? But in between, there's a vague thing going on, right? Why? Because the availability of evidence also comes on this spectrum, right? He has more and more evidence as times goes by. Where is it that it gets really bad for him? When is it that there's a threshold from where he just didn't know better to he's a horrible racist, even though he should have known better? Where is that threshold? Is going to be vague. It's not going to be a precise threshold, right? So if that threshold is vague, the theory should also leave it vague. So that's why, for instance, the book says, well, if evidence is available to you, then you should update on it. And if you don't, you're evidence resistant. But what this availability means is left to some extent vague, because that's how the phenomenon is in the world. This availability just is on a spectrum, right? So you go from no availability to a lot of availability, and it's not clear at which point you become a heap, as it were, at which point you have enough availability to be in trouble, right? So you need, basically, when you have this kind of vague phenomena, you need your theory to map onto that, right? So you need to leave your theory vague a little bit, and that's a feature, not a bug.
No, good. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And so you'd say that there are cases, or at least potentially are cases, where, people are more or less resistant to evidence, and there's not this boundary where someone is just resistant to evidence and the person before is not resistant at all, or something like that. No, it's sort of vague, right? And we don't have to give a more precise boundary than that, because maybe there isn't one.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's easy to see if you think about it in the following way. So someone who thinks climate change is not happening and lives in New York is resistance to evidence. Someone who thinks climate change is not happening and lives in an isolated village in the middle of Texas with 600 kilometers in all directions to the next town may well be just in evidence rejection, because this person maybe only has access to sources of information that give him misleading evidence on the topic. What's the situation of someone who lives in a place that's somehow in between New York and this isolated village? That's going to be the person that's going to be hard to diagnose, right? So there's going to be a lot of different people with different levels of availability of evidence, and some of them are going to be hard to diagnose because they're going to be somewhere in between, where it's not really clear, if they fall squarely on one side or the other.
Right, and then as you say, you construe evidence in the following sort of way: as a kind of knowledge indicator. As you say, it's like a fact E is evidence for a subject S that P, some proposition, is true, is the case if and only if S is in a position to know E, and E increases the evidential probability for P that S. So in some sort of kind of Bayesian sense, probability raising there. So that sounds right to you? That's your view?
Sounds correct. Yeah, sounds like a true view.
On the other side, you kind of give somewhat similar account of defeat as ignorance indicators, and it basically just works in the other direction, that the evidence would decrease the probability of different sorts of defeat, right? There's undercutting and then rebutting, but roughly it goes along this similar lines. I don't know. Could you kind of expand on this? What I think this is?
Yeah. So the way I think about it is as follows. So when it comes to evidence, the novelty of the account is that it is spelled out in terms of being in a position to know. So the having relation is the novelty comes in that there are other people in the literature who think that the relevant epistemic support relation has to do with increasing evidential probability. Now, a few things to detail about this. What is evidential probability? Evidential probability is, importantly, not subjective probability. So this is a very externalist account in that evidential probability is, if you want, the way to think about it is objective probability conditional on the evidence that you have. So you look at what evidence the cognizer has in their extant body of evidence, and you calculate what's the objective probability given that body of evidence, right? So it's a very objective measure. So what happens when a particular particular fact is a piece of evidence for this particular cognizer? Let's call them Mary. What's happening is Mary has this body of evidence. This new fact comes in, and it increases the objective probability of the relevant proposition that we're talking about, given Mary's total body of evidence that now includes this new fact, right? So the initial state is Mary has this body of evidence. Given this body of evidence, the probability that P is the case is, say, 0.7. Now that you have a new fact that's added, that probability increases. The objective probability given the full body of evidence increases. So that's how it works in terms of probabilities. And then when it comes to the having relation, it has to do with this being in a position to know. Where I unpack being in a position to know in functionalist terms, I like these functionalist frameworks because they're very naturalistically friendly. So I'm always worried when you work in normative domains about accounting on how these norms come about in nature, right? I mean, I like to work, in philosophy in a way that's scientifically decent. So I wanted to be empirically informed, and I want my norms to not come out of nothing, right? So not to be these metaphysically suspicious entities. And that's what functions give you. They give you these norms. Basically, every functional item is governed by norms, and that is not in any way metaphysically suspicious. So we know that hearts, when they don't do what they're supposed to do, they don't beat at the rate of 100 per minute or something like that, they're malfunctioning. That's a normative notion already. Why is that the case? Why are they malfunctioning? Well, because they have a function to pump blood in your circulatory system, and they're supposed to work in a way that reliably enough fulfills that function in normal environmental conditions. When are they malfunctioning? Where they don't do that. When they don't work in a way that reliably enough fulfills the function in normal environmental conditions. So that's how I think about our cognitive system as well, that it should, if it is to produce justified beliefs, it's supposed to work in a way that in normal environmental conditions generates knowledge, which is its function, right? So normally, if all goes well, I'm in a friendly environment, my cognitive system works in the normal way. It goes out there into the world, picks up some evidence, processes it neatly, produces a belief, and that belief is knowledgeable. That's how things go when things go well. So when my cognitive system works in this way, that in normal environmental conditions will produce knowledge, it produces justified beliefs. Of course, it might not produce knowledge if the environment is problematic. So my cognitive system might work in a proper way, but the environment might be really dubious, filled with misinformation, for instance, in which case I will have a justified belief because it's produced by a well-functioning cognitive system, but it will not be knowledge because the stuff that I take from the environment is rubbish is misleading evidence rather than evidence, right? So this functionalist framework is very neat to explain this kind of phenomena normatively. Notice that the same thing happens with hearts, right? So that's why I'm so keen on it. That is just a boring framework that works for hearts and digestive systems and all this other stuff, and we know that it works. So if you take my heart out of my chest and you put it in a vat with orange juice, my heart is still properly functioning, but it's not going to fulfill its function of pumping blood. It's going to pump orange juice. Why? Because it's in a rubbish environment for it. It can't pump blood because it's in a vat with orange juice. It's doing everything right, but the result is that it's pumping orange juice. So that's how I think about our cognitive system in an environment filled with misinformation, for instance. It can do everything right and still not be able to generate knowledge, generate a bunch of false beliefs because it takes up misinformation, misleading evidence rather than proper evidence. So when it comes to what it is to be in a position to know, going back to the having relation, I also unpack that in this kind of functionalist terms, where what it is to be in a position to know is that for a cognizer like you, so a species typical cognizer, you have this cognitive capacity to go into the world and take up this piece of evidence. That's why I'm in a position to know that there's a computer in front of me now, because I have a cognitive capacity that can take it up easily. And not only that I have it, but cognizers like me, they all have it. And that's why I'm not in a position to know what Adam is doing next door, because cognizers like me don't have a cognitive capacity to see through walls in order to take up evidence about what Adam is doing in the next room. So that's how I think about this. So now going back to what that tells us about evidence and defeat, that tells us a bunch of good things. So one thing that it tells us about evidence is that we can't hide from it. If it's available to our cognitive capacities, then we have it. It's not up to us to decide whether we have it or not. We can't just not believe it and thereby not have it. And all the moral responsibilities that come with having evidence, we have it. We have those moral responsibilities just in virtue of it lying in front of us. We don't need to also take it up. So we can't, going back to the detective, this explains why the detective who refuses to believe that his friend committed the murder because he just doesn't want to believe it in spite of all the evidence, can't go to the judge and say, I didn't have any evidence that my friend did it. How do you mean? He did it in front of you. Well, I didn't have it because I didn't believe it. That's why he can't say that, because having evidence has nothing to do with putting it inside your head. It has to do with the availability of it. So that's what the view explains. And the view also, when it comes to defeat, which, as you said correctly, just works the other way around. It just lowers my evidential probability. So you add it to my total body of evidence, and all of a sudden, my body of evidence supports that P less than it used to before you added it. The neat thing about my view of defeat that kind of, basically goes against most of the work on defeat that we know in the literature is that it gives a unified treatment to rebutting and undercutting defeaters, which is something that you mentioned earlier, that there are these two kinds of defeaters and that people usually like to give separate accounts thereof. And the reason why they like to do that is because it looks on prima facie as though they work via different mechanisms, right? So the rebutting defeat is evidence against P, right? So you have some evidence for P, and then rebutting defeaters come and give you evidence against P. Well, undercutting defeat, at least at first glance, doesn't seem to do that. It seems to the contrary, to not talk about P at all, but rather to just tell you that your source for this evidence that supports P is a rubbish source, right? So it seems to not be talking about P. It seems to just be talking about your source, right? So the classic case is, a testifier tells you, I don't know, that the train is coming at 8 o'clock. Another testifier tells you, no, it's not coming at 8 o'clock, it's coming at 9. So that's a rebutting defeater. But that's one case. But here's another case. A testifier tells you the train is coming at 8 o'clock. Another testifier tells you, don't believe that person. He's going around lying to people about when the train is coming because he's trying to mislead them. So now you have an undercutter to the testimony. And many people thought that because it looks like the undercutter is talking about the testifier, not about the proposition, the train is coming at 8, that these undercutters afford a completely different theorizing, a completely different account. Now, I am not, however, the first one to have noticed that this is not, this difference between undercutters and rebutters is not as neat as we would like it to be. In that sometimes rebutters are also undercutters, right? So here's one way in which that happens. I have a lot of evidence that 2 + 2 = 4. When you come and tell me that 2 + 2 = 5, my evidence is a rebutting defeater to your testimony. But it's also an undercutter because I'm going to start thinking that you went mad when you come and say that 2 + 2 = 5. So I'm going to not only distrust what you're saying, but I'm also going to lower my impression, the credibility that I give you as a testifier. So that's a case in which rebutters and undercutters seem to mix together. But here is a reason, a purely theoretical reason, to think that they can't be set apart. The way in which undercutters work is they defeat, as it were, the amount to which a particular piece of evidence probabilifies the proposition. So when you tell me that the train is coming at 8, and whatever Mary tells me that you're a compulsive liar about trains, what Mary does basically is she's telling me that your testimony probabilifies the proposition P, that trains are coming at 8, less than I thought, right? So initially you tell me trains are coming at P, and I take your testimony to probabilify P to a large extent. You seem like a perfectly decent testifier. So say that I think, well, probably 0.8 probability train is coming at 8. And now Mary comes and says, oh no, he's a horrible liar. So what Mary basically tells me is his testimony doesn't probabilify the proposition that the train is coming at 8 as highly as you thought. So now the thing to do for me is, of course, to first of all start believing that you're an unreliable testifier, but also decrease my confidence that the train is coming at 8. Why? Because now I found out that I, as it were, super probabilified it. I probabilified it too much based on your testimony. So this is why, this is how they work, right? So there shouldn't be anything controversial in what I said so far. But this, if that's how they work, it is mistaken to think that these undercutters only affect the source. They affect P as well, because they just tell me, have less confidence in P than you had because your evidence supporting P is less strong, right? It's less strong than you thought. Your evidence, this guy's testimony, doesn't probabilify it to 0.7. It probabilifies it to 0.5. So your evidence is not as strong as you thought. So now you should decrease your confidence in P. So undercutters are defeaters for P as well, not just for the reliability of the testifier. And I want to say that in epistemology, many people have been misled into thinking otherwise, just because they didn't notice that, the way in which it affects the source also has downstream consequences for the proposition, right? And as soon as you notice that, you know that you need a unified account on these defeaters. And my view just provides just that. So my view just says about all kinds of defeaters that they lower the evidential probability of the proposition. Rebutters are going to do that straight out. They're just going to come and say, this particular piece of evidence is going to support the proposition that it's, so your testimony is going to support the proposition the train is coming at 8.7. Mary's testimony that the train is coming as 9 is going to support the negation of your testimony to some extent, depending on how much reliability Mary comes with. And I'm just going to calculate, put those testimonies together, do the math, and I'm going to have basically the level of confidence that is afforded by these two pieces of evidence, the evidence that you provided and the defeater that Mary provided. That's the case of rebutting defeat, that's easy. While in the case of undercutters, what happens is I start with 0.7, Mary comes and says, actually, he's a compulsive liar, and then I lower to as low as this testimony tells me I should probabilify P given your testimony, right? So in both cases, my evidential probability for P decreases. It by different mechanisms, but in both cases it decreases. So that's what the account predicts.
Yeah, that seems right. I mean, in terms of, if it was some support in the first place, it contributed to your, or at least should have contributed to your credence that you have in P, and then you have some reason to doubt or at least lower your confidence that that source is reliable, then you have some reason to lower your confidence in P, right? Because it was contributing to that and you have lower support for that as a result of this defeater. And then, trying to give a unified account. I just want to ask a quick question about, because I could see people having issue with the kind of functionalist account of normativity here, and because we might agree that something may have certain tendencies, dispositions, things may behave normally in certain ways, but it might be a whole other thing to say that, well, that's its right functioning, or that's how it should behave, or it's wrong if it weren't to do that. So we might say there's a gap between normal function and proper function, if that makes sense. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I love this account of functions. It's not mine, however, so I'm just building my view on it. I'm also just cherry picking the claims that I kind of like in this account. So for instance, the account that I'm using is an etiological account, right? So where function acquisition has to do with the history of success, because the trait did this successful thing, pump blood, and because that was good for the organism continued to exist, and thereby the trait continued to exist. And that's what explains why the trait has this function, because of this kind of historical benefit mechanism where it did something good in the past that was good for the system that it inhabits, and that's what explains why hearts still exist or something like that. So there's the etiological account. Now there are many etiological accounts. The first ones were asked for selection over generations for function acquisition because their paradigmatic model were hearts. More recent accounts figured out that that's an implausible story because some traits sometimes acquire functions really quickly. So you don't need selection over generations. For the paradigmatic example is mutations, right? So mutations really quickly start acquiring the function of doing what they're doing. And if they're beneficial mutations, they actually transmit in further future generations because of this benefit that they bring. So now we know that actually an account of functions that asks for a long history is implausible, which for epistemology is important because it looks as though I can acquire a particular mechanism can acquire an epistemic function really quickly, right? So glasses, I started wearing glasses only a couple of weeks ago. I think that now they have an epistemic function. Now I know how to work with them to get information from the environment. So it's all good. So this is just a lot to say, a lot of words to say that I'm cherry picking my preferred account of functions without contributing to the functions literature itself. Now, your point about the difference between is and ought, basically, right? From this is how this thing normally functions to this is how this thing should function, it's a good point. Now, the reason why I choose this etiological theory to begin with is because everybody in functions literature agrees that it has normative import. So it's on them, not on me, to answer this question. Is the short answer. But here is why. Let me explain why people find it plausible that it has normative import. The thought is that the heart only continues to exist to begin with because it's doing this thing. It's pumping blood. If it hadn't done this thing, it would have disappeared. So that's the thing with etiological functions. They explain the continuous existence of the trait. They don't need to fully explain it. They just need to, saliently contribute to the explanation. There might be other factors that explain why the heart exists. But the point is that the fact that it pumped blood kept people alive, or whatever, organisms in general alive. And they reproduced. And that's what makes it such that hearts exist today. Turns it normative. The heart ought to work in a way that reliably pumps blood because that's what's keeping it alive. If it doesn't do that, it disappears. That's kind of roughly the normative step that's taken in this literature. Now, what you might like better, which I do, but it's secret, is the opposing account of functions, which many people think is not normative. I think they're wrong. This is the Cummins view, the systemic function account. So on this account, the function of a trait is just what it does in the system, not what it done in the past and what all that story doesn't exist. The historical bit doesn't exist. What does it do in the system? That's its function. What does your heart do? It pumps blood. That's its function. And many people thought, well, that's not normative. Just as you said, just because it does it, it doesn't follow that it ought to do it, right? But here is the way in which you get normativity on this view. You use the token type distinction. So hearts do it. The type hearts. They pump blood in organisms. That's what they do. That's what hearts do in the systems. So a token is malfunctioning if it's not like the type, basically, if it doesn't do what the type does. So that's the way in which you can get normativity on a Cummins view, whereby the reason why a token that's malfunctioning is bad is because it's not working like the type. And in principle, when you're a token of a type, you should have the properties that the type has, at least those properties. So that kind of makes a bit more sense. Now, one thing that I do agree with you and other people who complain about this is that you don't get a lot of thick normativity. So you don't get anything, like moral categorical imperatives out of this functionalist story. So you get, the normativity that I get on my epistemological account is just as thin or thick as the normativity that the cardiologist gets when he comes and says the heart is malfunctioning. I don't get more than that. It's cardiology normativity that I'm putting forth here. So people might be upset. Well, honestly, we want thicker normative categories in epistemology because we want to say epistemology is important, like ethics, right? So in ethics, we have this very serious normative constraints where it looks like when I say we ought not torture children, I say more than just my digestive system is malfunctioning. It ought not work in that way. It seems like it's a bit of a different category. I don't know about ethics. I haven't seen a well-defended functionalist view in ethics. I think it can be done, but the stuff that I've seen, I don't like very much. But I think in epistemology, we don't need more than what I give. And here is why. First of all, we all need to accept that our cognitive systems have an epistemic function, right? I mean, you don't need to be a functionalist like me in order to accept this claim, right? we all also need to accept that there are such things as malfunctioning hearts. If there are such things as malfunctioning hearts because they have a function, and if we accept that the cognitive system has a function, we surely have to accept also that there are such things as epistemically malfunctioning cognitive systems. So basically, insofar as we accept this kind of basic claims that hearts have a function, therefore they can be malfunctioning, cognitive systems have an epistemic function, therefore they can be epistemically malfunctioning, I get all the normativity that I want. And then you might think, yeah, but here are some categories that your view struggles to explain. Is it really true? It seems as though we can blame people when they have rubbish beliefs. But it doesn't seem okay to blame people for badly digesting stuff, right? So is it really thick enough? Because it seems as though epistemic normativity gives us this thickness that allows us to assign responsibility, while digestive normativity doesn't. And I want to say, actually, that's false. So here's what's going on. Epistemic normativity is like digestive normativity in all cognizers, in that it is not okay to blame kids, for instance, for having false beliefs. It's okay to blame us for believing all kind of rubbish stuff, but it's not okay to blame kids because they're just, not sophisticated enough to be blamed. It's also not okay to blame dogs for whatever they believe or whatever other non-sophisticated cognizers we think harbor beliefs, right? So clearly it would be ridiculous for me to start shouting at my children that they should change their beliefs when they're 3 years old. So that suggests that it's only in sophisticated cognizers that epistemic blame is actually warranted. But that's fine, right? Because the digestive system is also the kind of system that we can't blame people for. Why? Because we are not sophisticated enough to have control over how we digest. Just like my kids are not sophisticated enough to have control over how they form beliefs. When we become older, we have a bit more control over how we evaluate evidence. We can talk to people, we can change our minds. Kids don't have that kind of control. So, if you're a friend of a control condition on blame, all of this makes sense. I don't have control over digestion, nor do my kids have control over their beliefs. That's why I'm not to blame for my bad digestion, and my kids are not to blame for their bad beliefs. As soon as I'm sophisticated enough to have control, I start being blameworthy for my beliefs and judgments, for instance. Still not about my digestion, because no matter how sophisticated a cognizer are, I'm still a pretty stupid digester. But yeah, so that's what my view is going to say. And to be honest, look, I'm open to people who like thicker ways to think about normativity to come and tell me, here's a piece of data that you can't account for with this functionalist normativity. And for me to try to account for it, I am still to see a piece of data that I can't account for. But I'm open to it. So basically the thought is, bring it on. I'm happy to try to account for your intuition that there's something thicker to epistemic normativity than what I'm putting forth. And if there is some data that I have trouble accommodating, I'm also perfectly happy to change my mind and search for more sophisticated normative resources than functions can give us. But until that happens, until I'm convinced that we need more sophisticated cognitive resources, I'm very happy with functionalist normativity, because at least it gives me this peace of mind that it's all empirically kosher.
That's all good. I was wondering if you could even be a bit like more neutral in that, like you could think, like take the rest of your account. Potentially that could be accommodated in a theory which took a more robust view about normativity, and all the stuff about, evidence resistance and so on could still be the same more or less in there. You just have a different view a bit about function.
That's exactly right. So one trivial way to spell out my account is in terms of virtues, for instance. So if you're someone who likes virtues, it's absolutely trivial to do it in terms of virtues, because this kind of capacities with functions other people think are just virtues. So if you're a virtue theorist, you can basically with Control F and replace, you can build your theory really quickly by replacing all talk of cognitive capacities with functions with just epistemic virtues. Yeah, so that's just one example. So if the kind of person who thinks, well, yes, virtues are going to give us the kind of normativity that we want. That being said, in personal conversation with Ernie Sosa, he tells me that people complain about this normative woomph problem when it comes to his account as well. So I don't know, maybe the normative woomph people need to tell us more a bit about what this normative woomph is. Because the only thing that I've heard so far, which is why I'm talking about this, is this responsibility, blameworthiness thing, and I accounted for it. Another thing that I heard is, well, we want it to be categorical imperative, whatever the epistemic norm is. And I mean, I don't like categorical imperatives anywhere, including in ethics. I think we should lie to the Nazi when he comes to the door. So, if the only problem that I have is that I don't account for categorical imperatives, that's great, because we shouldn't account for any categorical imperatives to begin with. But yeah, basically what I'm saying is, give me a precise problem that I have. Spell out this womb. Stop talking in metaphors. Tell me exactly what the normative womb that I'm missing is, and I'm going to try and see whether my view can accommodate it, like with any data. And if I can't, I have some problems, of course.
Yeah. It's almost as if like the people who are still worried about the not having enough normative oomph are really wouldn't be satisfied with anything short of like a robust non-naturalist like normative realism. And I mean, this is maybe a whole other kind of worms, although connected. Like I sometimes struggle to understand what that's supposed to be even exactly.
Yeah, that's the problem, right? So it's always a bit metaphorical. I mean, if it's not metaphorical, I'm very happy to try to account for it. But if the thought is just I need it to be heavier than this, I don't know what that means. I really struggle. But I mean, again, even for fans of categorical imperatives, I gotta say, I mean, functionalism in a way does give you a categorical imperative in the following sense: for a particular function of a particular type, if you're not working in a way in which it reliably is generated in normal conditions, you're doing something wrong, no matter what other things you're doing well. So basically, one important feature of categoricity is that it's not easy to override, right? So categorical imperatives, you don't override them well. But now notice that we want that thing more in morality than in epistemology, right? Because, sometimes it's perfectly fine to do epistemically badly just to do morally well, right? So when push comes to shove, let's save the children, no matter what false beliefs they need to form about it. But so I think that that's true. But also, my account is able to predict that if you form false beliefs in order to save children from drowning, there's something wrong with what you're doing. In that you're epistemically malfunctioning, you shouldn't be able to do that. Right? So if you by some miracle manage to form some false beliefs on command just to save someone, so if someone comes and says, I'm going to shoot this child, and unless you falsely believe that climate change is not happening, and you manage to get yourself to form that belief, I want to say there's something really fishy with you, right? Voluntarism doesn't work that well, right? So if you're able to form that false belief just to save the child, all things considered, normatively, you're great. Epistemically, you're malfunctioning, because that's not something you should be able to do. So I think that the account is still going to tell you a few things. So it's got a bit of categoricity in it, given that this kind of epistemic normativity doesn't just vanish when it's overridden by moral concerns.
Good. Yeah. So I did want to come to just now. I mean, we've sort of been covering some of the pieces to this, but just to spell out how you think about resistance to evidence as a sort of epistemic malfunction. I'll just read one thing you say here is like, a subject S's belief formation capacity C is malfunctioning epistemically if there is sufficient evidence supporting P that is easily available to be taken up via C, and C fails to output a belief that P. So, I mean, could you expand on this a little bit and maybe explain how this accommodates some of the classic cases?
Yeah, so it's easy again to think about the difference between evidence resistance and mere justified evidence rejection. So what's happening is, here I'll take two cognizers. The evidence-resistant cognizer is someone who is surrounded by a bunch of evidence supporting P, and they either don't take it up, or they take it up but they don't update properly on it. So the evidence is easily available to this person. They have cognitive capacities that they can use to take up this evidence from their environment or from their internal environment, because sometimes the evidence is already in our head. All we need to do is pick it up, as it were. But they fail to do so. For one reason or another, for my account, it doesn't matter why. It can be because of bias, it can be because of lack of attention, it really doesn't matter. So they fail to update their beliefs accordingly. That's a case of evidence resistance. A case of evidence rejection, a corresponding case, is going to be a case in which you have all this evidence. For instance, you have all this evidence lying around, but it is defeated. So that's why you don't take it up. So you're justified to reject this evidence because you have defeaters. And that happens a lot especially in isolated communities. So I ran a study with a colleague from social science in Black and Caribbean communities in Scotland on trying to figure out whether, so these people rejected the vaccine. The vaccine uptake in Black and Caribbean communities in Scotland was much lower than in your boring white population, whereby white people took up the vaccine 70 something percent, and I think Black and Caribbean people 40 something percent, huge difference. And we went then together with this colleague and we ran some social science qualitative studies that were epistemologically informed to figure out what was going on there. Was it evidence resistance or was it rejection, justified evidence rejection? And my account was very useful because it predicted, look, if these people have all the evidence in the world that vaccines are safe and they're just not taking up this evidence or not updating properly in terms of it, they're evidence resistant. However, if they have this evidence but is defeated by other misleading evidence, misleading defeaters that suggest either that this evidence is no good or that the source of this evidence is no good, then they are perfectly rational cognizers that are just rejecting evidence like you and I would do, and there's nothing wrong with them. And indeed, you're not going to be surprised to find out that when we went into these communities, it turned out that the vast majority were completely rational evidence rejecting, in that they were not believing what the NHS was saying. So the NHS sent them a flyer, just like they sent me, saying vaccines are very safe, come and take them. Now, for me, the testimony from the NHS was not defeated. The NHS is a perfectly reliable testifier for me. They haven't done anything bad to me in the past. I believe the flyer, I took the vaccine. These guys have a completely different history with the NHS. The NHS has a long history of discriminating against Black people, lying to Black people, even though they knew that some particular medications were unsafe. I'm not going to go into the very depressing history that the NHS has of racial discrimination. So these people were rationally cautious because they had undercutting defeaters to the testimony that they received from the NHS. For them, this testifier is far less reliable in their history than it is with me, when they never lied to me, right? They lied to them in the past. So they shouldn't have taken the vaccine. If anything, the irrational ones are the ones that did it, because it was an unreliable testifier telling them to inject some substance in themselves. Of course, they shouldn't have done it. So why is this important? Why is it important that my theory makes this distinction? Because, again, now that we know why they didn't take the vaccine, we know what to do. We don't need to go and educate these people about vaccines more, which is what a lot of the British media suggested. This uneducated population hasn't taken up the vaccine. What should we do? We should educate these people better. No, that's not the problem. It's not a lack of education problem. The problem is that they don't trust the health authorities, and they don't trust them for good reason. So what we need to do is intervene in their evidential environment to bring in trustworthy sources to defeat the defeaters. That's how it works in epistemology. If you have defeaters, the only way in which you can get rid of them is by defeaters, right? You have this body of evidence, defeater comes in and kind of cancels it out, or it lowers its evidential capacity. The way to solve this situation is to bring in defeaters that gets rid of these defeaters, right? So the way to do it is you bring in trustworthy sources into this communities that are going to tell them, no, the vaccines are safe. And that testimony is going to defeat the undercutters to the testimony by the NHS. So that's kind of how the view works. And I want to say it works well. I mean, it's, we tested it in a small community, but it worked. And just, I think we're still evaluating the results of like the societal impact of this study. But what is interesting is that we already know that we ran an entire documentary on this case. So my colleague Josephine from Social Science filmed a documentary about this situation with this Black and Caribbean communities and with Public Health Scotland and the vaccine people at Oxford and so on. And what is interesting is that the fact that we did this documentary and that we went into these communities and that we launched the documentary and we had a big kind of public roundtable on it, convinced more people to take the vaccine than the NHS flyer. So, that tells you something about the importance of this theory. So yeah, the theory says, look, resistance to evidence is a very problematic thing, but don't think that it happens every day in all communities that seem to not trust scientific expertise. Sometimes these people just have defeaters, and we need to work on that. So I think that's useful, really.
Yeah, for sure. So let's see, a few things I want to bring up. Well, I mean, this is sort of the same issue raised before regarding, I mean, you brought up regarding vagueness or lack of. I mean, there's certain terms in here in this account that haven't been really clarified. So, like when we talk about it being sufficient evidence supporting P, well, what is it being? What does sufficient really involve? I mean, maybe we have a rough idea, like, okay, this would definitely be sufficient. Hey, this wouldn't be sufficient, but there's not like a very precise account of
Yeah,
sufficiency there, and maybe other things. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, nobody gives you sufficiency thresholds.
yeah,
I like a probability one account of knowledge, the Tim Williamson account. I like it. I've never defended it, but I like it. But I am also firmly convinced that you don't need knowledge for action, and I've argued in the past. So I think that when it comes to sufficient evidence for action, it's going to depend a lot with the stakes, right? So, we know that from science. When it comes to testing an acne treatment, we need to put in less evidential work than when we're testing a treatment for cancer. So I think that what's important is a couple of things. First of all, to figure out that sufficient evidence for action varies with the stakes of the action. Sufficient evidence for belief varies with your epistemological commitments, and the two don't have anything to do with each other. So I don't need my members of the Black and Caribbean communities to form full beliefs in order to go and get vaccines. The only thing that I need is for them to figure out that the way in which probabilities and utilities combined is a better expected utility to go and get the vaccine than not to get it. That suspending on the issue is just not an option. You either get it or you don't get it. So the risk of dying occurs on both on both horns. So you can't really just abstain from this choice. But that being said, when it comes to epistemology alone, I have argued in the past, for one thing, that we shouldn't accept a pragmatically encroached view on the sufficiency of evidence for full belief. So even if you are not like me and you don't care about having a full evidential probability one view for belief, you should still, if you're a fallibilist, as it were, you should still be a fixed threshold fallibilist. And that's because, as I've argued, I think conclusively, we have no reason to believe that what is sufficient in terms of evidence for belief varies with practical stakes. What is sufficient for action varies with practical stakes, but what is sufficient for belief stays fixed wherever your preferred view of the sufficiency threshold places it, where it's at 1 if you're infallibilist or lower if you're a fallibilist. And I think that that's important for our purposes here, and not only for our purposes here, for purposes in science more generally, right? Because one thing that scientists and philosophers of science worry about has to do with inductive risk. They worry a lot about it. So they're thinking, look, we can never know for sure. So how much should we, because of this inductive risk? So how much should we investigate? When can we stop investigating? When do we have sufficient evidence to stop investigating? And I guess the answer is complicated. First of all, you have sufficient evidence to stop investigating whenever the stakes tell you that you have sufficient evidence to act on it, right? Because science, we don't do it just for the sake of forming beliefs. We do it for the sake of saving people's lives. So if you're a scientist that works on acne, you don't need to worry much about rechecking your evidence over and over again. If you work on cancer, maybe do a bit more work. So that's one question. Secondly, when do you have enough evidence to form a belief that this particular cancer treatment is correct or this particular acne treatment is correct? At the same time for both of them. And that's when you know. So I guess that's the answer that the knowledge first, or maybe somewhat unsatisfyingly, is going to give. When can we stop investigating? When can we form a belief? When you know. When can we stop investigating for practical purposes, for putting it into treatments and sending it into the population? Where it matches the stakes. So that's the difference between the normativity of action and the normativity of belief. Normativity of belief is stable and doesn't vary with stakes. Normativity of action does. Even if you're a skeptic scientist and you're thinking, or philosopher of science, and you're thinking, well, probability one is needed for belief, and I can never reach probability one in science because science is hard, that's fine. You can still go and treat people with your results, but just don't form those beliefs. So I guess that's, I think that's an important result, that we don't need this sufficiency threshold that much. We might need it for belief formation, but we don't need it to do science. We don't need it to walk around the streets. We don't need it for anything like that. That being said, I think that evidential probability one, what people miss is that it's not actually that hard. It's evidential probability one that you need to get. You don't need to get Cartesian certainty. The two are not the same thing. So I think people, when they hear probability one, they imagine that you need Cartesian certainty and are a bit puzzled. That's not what it is. Evidential probability one need not be Cartesian certainty.
Right. But I mean, but if you start with less than evidential probability one, how are we ever updating to get to that, right? In a reasonable way.
Yeah, I mean, my thinking is that even if you're a fallibilist, and you know what happens when you're a fallibilist, inductive risk agglomerates, right? So that's what happens when you have something like 0.9 probability for this and 0.9 probability for this other thing, and then the conjunction is going to have less than 0.9, and the more conjuncts you have, the more risk you're going to get. So that's something to worry about, absolutely. And what is the view going to predict? Well, my view, in combination with the fallibilist account, is going to predict that you shouldn't believe that conjunction until you get to the threshold of 0.9, if that's your preferred threshold that you're working with. And there's going to be interesting technical results of that, which fallibilism does deliver, like failures of closure and transmission and so on. I don't like those results. That's why I like probability one. But yeah, so that's, if you're a fallibilist, you've got your work cut out. That's, I guess, is what I'm saying. But what is important is, I think, that we should not be extraordinarily worried about the looming skeptical scenario. Because that's something to worry about if you're an epistemologist, even if you don't worry that scientists don't know when to stop investigating cancer treatments, you might still worry about skepticism, right? I don't think the skeptical scenario is that looming. And I don't, in particular, what's more important is I don't think that going for a pragmatically encroached view where the threshold varies with practical stakes is going to help at all with the skeptical scenario. So let me explain why. So here's one way to motivate this pragmatic encroachment. You might think, well, if the threshold is not at 1, it's got to be ad hoc, right? I mean, where are you going to set it? It's going to say that you want to set it at 0.8. That's a bit ad hoc, right? So that's a rubbish view. But our view is nicely motivated. What sets the threshold are the practical stakes. So we should prefer a pragmatically encroached view. So I don't think that's a proper way to motivate pragmatic encroachment, and here is why. I think the problem reappears immediately for pragmatic encroachment. So I agree that it's hard to say the threshold is at 0.8 or 0.5. But here's what happens in pragmatic encroachment. The only thing that the pragmatic encroacher gives you is an ordering of thresholds. So pragmatic encroacher that just tells you that the threshold for believing that the cancer treatment is the correct one is higher than the threshold for believing that the acne treatment is correct. That's all they tell you. So they give you a threshold orderings. But they also don't tell you where exactly is the threshold for cancer and where exactly is the threshold for acne, right? They don't tell you that. So when the question is asked, what is the threshold for cancer beliefs, they're going to be just as ad hoc as I am. They're going to say around 0.8, right? So the question is, why 0.8? Why not 0.79? Why not 0.85, right? So there's not a lot more, less ad hocness if you're a pragmatic encroachment. All you get is this ordering. You don't really get anything non-ad hoc about the precise threshold.
Yeah, that seems fair. I mean, you could have more fleshed out views, different sort of contextualists and variantists and so on that might have more to say there. And also, I mean, I guess there is the worry that, well, maybe there's reason to think, like empirically, that people's like knowledge or evidence attributions or justification attributions do vary with, I don't know, things like stakes or other features of the context or of the attribution. So I mean, that's going back to more of the empirical side of, I don't know, folk discourse and concepts and so on. But I don't know. And obviously, there's a debate that continues on those matters.
Yeah,
but I don't know. What do you think about it?
I mean, a couple of things. I'm personally, and I think that you're going to agree with this, judging by your question. I'm personally less concerned about the truth of contextualism about knowledge attributions than I am about pragmatic encroachment. So if contextualist just tells me in natural language we speak in these shifty ways, whatever, the contextualist hasn't yet told us that we speak correctly, right? So, it may well be. I mean, we're speaking correctly about so many things. I mean, you should see, depression attributions. We attribute depression very broadly. We say depression all the time. Whenever you ask me, how I'm feeling, I'm not going to say something like I'm sad. I'm going to say, oh, I'm very depressed today. Something didn't happen. Of course, that's very bad depression talk. So if you ask the specialist, they're going to tell you that's not the proper way to attribute depression. So a view that just says, well, people attribute depression in this particular weird way, it doesn't tell us anything about the nature of depression or about the correct way to attribute it. So if contextualist just tells me that people do weird stuff with knowledge attributions, but without any commitment to that being the correct way, then that's fine. Unfortunately, defenders of contextualists tend to also make the correctness claim, right? So the Rose notably says something like, we should take this at face value, right? Is the methodology of the straightforward. We should take the folk way of speaking at face value. So if folk speak in this way, we should think that is the correct way to speak. And that's why I fall off board, right? So that's why I don't like pragmatic encroachment, because that's a substantive thesis about knowledge. That's a substantive thesis that says, no, as a matter of fact, the metaphysical phenomenon is shifty with stakes. It's not just the way in which people happen to speak. So that's problematic. Going back, however, I don't think we have enough reason to even think that people speak in that way. So looking at the linguistic data and all the experimental philosophy that has been done, I remain unconvinced that the evidence is heavier on the contextualist side. Indeed, the reason why I'm unconvinced, which I defended quite at length in the past, is because people don't distinguish, because they're not philosophers, between all things considered propriety and epistemic propriety. That's a very technical thing, right? We barely distinguish between them ourselves as philosophers, right? So when people say, is it correct for Rose to attribute knowledge to himself in these bank cases? And they think, yeah, it's correct. They don't think it's epistemically correct or all things considered correct, right? So it is compatible with people thinking that it's correct, that actually it is just all things considered correct, and that it's risky for Rose to say that he knows, because if he says that he knows, his wife is not going to stop at the bank, and he is going to end up with a bouncing check on Monday. Compatibly, it might be epistemically perfectly fine for him to say that he knows, because he knows that he knows, right? But of course, you can't go in the population and run experimental philosophy and figure out whether folks, what they mean to say is that it's epistemically appropriate for Rose to attribute knowledge to himself rather than all things considered appropriate, because people just don't understand these words. They don't know what it is about. So I'm quite curious to see however we could settle it, because it's not settled just because people say it's not appropriate, because appropriate doesn't track epistemically appropriate. If anything, appropriate in folks' mouth is going to track all things considered appropriate, right? So I think that we need more evidence even to believe that the contextualist data obtains in everyday discourse. And then even more evidence to move, as you like to put it, from is to ought, from the fact that that's how people speak, even if it turns out that they speak in that way, to the fact that they actually speak correctly. I mean, sometimes people speak of knowledge as being false. People use words in social science all the time, words as knowledges, which gives me cold sweats on my back when I hear them. So, people sometimes speak in funny ways, that's all.
So just one more quick remark on that, and then I had another thing about a case that I wanted to see how your account deals with. I mean, we might think that we're in favor of, so if people do actually speak in shifty ways regarding knowledge or evidence attributions, we might take that as a guide to the sort of claims that they're actually making. So like their actual epistemic concepts. And if the epistemic concepts are in fact shifty, then I mean, descriptively, it seems right to say that knowledge shifts with context. At least, for the target here is the normal epistemic concepts that people have. That might not map onto some more philosophical notion or something that we might engineer. But I mean, if there is this shiftiness in everyday normal thought and talk, and it reflects the concepts that people have when they're expressing these thoughts, then you see where I'm going there?
Yeah. So I agree with it, all else equal. So I think that language is serious evidence, but it's just evidence among other pieces of evidence. So I think, yes, we should take it seriously. We don't have a lot of evidence to the nature of this phenomena. And one important piece of evidence is the way in which we speak, because presumably there's a reason why we speak in that way, because it feels right to us to speak in that way. So maybe there's a reason we speak in that way, because that's how our concepts are. So our speech follows our concepts, and our concepts follow the phenomena. So maybe our concepts are the best indication we have about the nature of the phenomena, and our language are the best evidence we have about the nature of our concepts. That being said, this is all fallibilist talk. Disconnections are not infallible at all, and indeed we know of famous cases when they're not, even reliable disconnections. So I guess what I was saying earlier is, look, if we have reason, if folk say about the rose, he shouldn't attribute knowledge to himself in the high stakes case, that is prima facie evidence to believe that folk think that knowledge attribution, correct knowledge attribution, varies with stakes. And it is also prima facie evidence to think that our concept follows suit and the nature of knowledge follows suit, because all of this stuff is evidentially related to each other. But only prima facie, absent defeat. And I guess what I was trying to do is give some defeaters and say, look, when people speak in this way, when they say it's not appropriate for the rose to attribute knowledge to himself in the high stakes case, they don't specify the type of appropriateness that they're talking about. So for all we know, they might mean practically appropriate for the rose to attribute knowledge to himself. Maybe what people mean is to say he shouldn't say that he knows, because the wife is not going to stop the car at the bank and he's going to end up in jail. And indeed, we have even good reason to believe that that's what they're doing, because people are not very good at epistemic normativity. They are not very good at tracking the difference between moral and epistemic normativity. That's something that needs theorizing, right? Backing different types of normativities that are at work in a particular context. So what I was trying to do is basically, so I agree with you, language, evidence for concepts, concepts, evidence for the phenomenon. However, evidence is defeasible, and I was trying to give you a defeater for the evidence. I'm not sure that the evidence even supports what is taken to support at language level, basically, that this language suggests epistemic appropriateness, because appropriate, of course, is ambiguous between epistemic, practical, and so on. So it's not clear to me that even we have the linguistic data for this entire evidential chain. Compatibly, maybe there are ways to design experimental philosophical, investigations that manage to distinguish this thing. Maybe follow-up questions, something like, do you mean that he shouldn't say it because he's going to end up in jail, or do you mean that he just shouldn't say it because he doesn't know it, or something like that? So maybe more experimental philosophical investigation is needed, and maybe even better, because this is pretty new, right? Experimental philosophy. So it's not even clear to me how good we are at it, given that it's such a new field. So I'm not excluding that there may come a point when it's going to be conclusively proven that what folk mean is that epistemically speaking, the rose should not attribute knowledge to himself. In which case, I think, yes, we have very strong linguistic evidence that our concept of knowledge is shifty, because we have very strong linguistic evidence that our attributions vary with stakes, right? So I guess it's what I'm saying is we need more evidence for this claim. And it's kind of an easy job for me to say that, also because the default case is invariantism, right? So the default position is invariantism, and that's something that even contextualists agree with, that contextualism and pragmatic encroachment need argument, while the default position remains invariantism, because is the view that has more prior plausibility to begin with. For reasons such as it doesn't look as though just by caring less about something, I get to know it more easily, right? So yeah, it's like with any view, the more evidence you have for a view, the better it is supported, I guess. But I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that the data is not as trivially supporting contextualism, the linguistic data.
Yeah, that's perfectly fair. I think there's some support for it, but there's room for better empirical research there. And then, as you say, yeah, we might accept that that's maybe how people talk, but maybe they do so incorrectly. So there's more to say there. Yes, I did want to bring up a case and that sort of came up as a worry to me about your account of resistance evidence, and see what you think about it. So we brought up cases of mathematical beliefs earlier, and that, you shouldn't be expected to believe all the consequences of the P&O axioms, even if you believe the P&O axioms. But what about just some mundane mathematical beliefs? So I have easily available sufficient evidence to me that 68 plus 57 equals 125. but I might fail to believe that, but presumably I don't. And even if that's like one of the easier things for me to now come to believe based on what evidence is available to me, I wouldn't say that that's some sort of epistemic malfunction.
Things
But it
often.
sounds like your account would say that it's, yeah.
So this is an important bit that needs to be understood about the account, because many people worry, well, I'm in a position to know so many things easily, so why do I believe all this stuff? Because clearly I don't have the cognitive capacity to believe them all at the same time. I don't have the cognitive capacity to hold in the front of my mind all this easy mathematical results and at the same time, go about my life every day. That's just not something I can do. So what I think that this is a problem. My account doesn't have this problem, because the way in which I am be in a position to know limits the, as it were, the number of facts that you can know at the same time. So even if individually you are able very easily to calculate 65 plus 18 or whatever, one thing you're not able to do is do that and 600 other sums in your head, talk to me right now, and also cook dinner. You're just not able to do that at the same time, right? So being in a position to know doesn't mean is not only limited, if you want, qualitatively, in that you can know simple sums, but you're not good enough of a mathematician so to come up with very complicated arithmetical truths. It's also quantitatively limited in that what is in your body of evidence, so what the stuff that you're in a position to know at one particular point in time, is a subset of all the individual things that you might access at that particular point in time. And that subset is limited quantitatively by your cognitive capacities, which is why, again, the functionalist framework is very useful, because it explains this limitation. Your cognitive capacities can't do more, therefore they don't have to do more. If basically, just think about it in terms of perception. If I can only form 20 beliefs at the same time, say that's my cognitive capacity, just by looking in front of me, I have information overload, because there's more material there than for 20 beliefs. So what does my account predict about this? Well, it doesn't predict that I should now come to know everything that's in my visual field, because it's too much. What it predicts is that I should come to know the most readily available subset that's as large as I can deal with. So basically, look at everything that's happening in my visual field, rank them by availability. So, the most central to my visual field, the most sparkly and, colorful, and so on. So whatever goes into availability for my perceptual capacities. And if I can only form 20 beliefs, those first 20 are going to be the things that I need to update on. The most readily available 20 bits, not everything that's happening in my visual field. Similarly, when you're talking to me right now, I don't think, although I don't know you well enough, that you have the cognitive capacity to also do sums in your mind. Therefore, even though in principle you could do that, you can't by my account now, because you're already, as it were, wasting your cognitive capacity on this conversation with me instead of putting it to good use on mathematical exercises. So that also explains, data such as when someone is not paying attention to what they're doing, right? So when I was little, very often my mom would get very annoyed with the fact that she would send me to get something from the cupboard. I would look straight at it, but I would be so, in my head that I wouldn't see it. So I'd say things like, I don't see it. Where is it? And she was like, you're looking straight at it. The cup is right in front of you. And when that happens, we tend to find the reason, because it looks so malfunctional when someone is looking straight at the thing and not seeing them. We have a tendency to find an excuse, right? To say something like, they're thinking about something. They're really concerned. They're thinking about their philosophy paper, or they're really concerned with the well-being of this relative that's in the hospital. We always tend to explain it away in this exact sense that my theory predicts, that their cognitive capacities are busy doing these other 20 things. That's why they can't, see the cup in front of them or do mathematical operations. So my theory not only qualitatively restricts what you're in a position to know, in that I'm in a position to know the laptop is here, but not that Adam is doing whatever he's doing because I can't see through walls. It's also quantitative limitations that it imposes, in that the only stuff that goes in your body of evidence is the subset that you're in a position to know, in the sense in which it's not larger than your quantitative cognitive capacities.
Good. Yeah. Okay. So let me maybe modify the case slightly so that, to be clear, so we're not, I suppose that I'm in a situation where I'm not anywhere near my cognitive limitations. I'm not really having to focus on many things or doing much like that. And it turns out that like one of the easiest things, if not the easiest things for me to take up is this evidence regarding simple mathematical sums. Say it is something like 68 plus 57 is 125. But I don't do that. Maybe just because I don't know. I don't feel like doing it or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, good. So here's what I'm going to say about that case. So if you're a cognizer like me, the most readily available stuff for you is never mathematical truths. It's the stuff that's happening in front of your eyes. So if you're not thinking about anything, if you completely clear your mind, the 20 things that you're able to come to know are always going to be things in your visual field, because those are the most readily available. So strictly speaking, when we do mathematics, we need to pull ourselves from that, right? So we don't watch TV at the same time we're doing mathematics, right? So we either do it on a paper, because then we can focus on mathematics alone. We don't focus on other stuff that's happening in our environment, or we close our eyes, we do it in our mind. But one thing that we don't do is at the same time take up a lot of stimuli from our environment and think about mathematical truths, right? Why is that? Because the stimuli in our environment are taking up those 20 slots that we have in our cognitive capacity, right? So if you're anything like me, it's never the case that 65 plus 13 is the most readily available thing that you can do, because you're busy with all this perception stuff. So that's one thing. Another thing that I want to say is, let's say, however, that you're such a mathematical genius that for you, doing sums, it's so easy that it's just as easy as taking up information from this laptop in front of me, right? Because you're just awkward like that, right? You're such a mathematical genius that it's literally the exact same degree of difficulty to do maths and to take up stuff from what's happening in front of you. That's a discussion that I already have. You'll be happy to hear with Tim Williamson, in that his worry was similar, but more in abstract, in that he was saying, well, what if it so happens that you have two pieces of evidence with the same availability score? So you have this, so say that you can only take up 20, the first 19 are nicely ordered, but then 20 and 21 have exactly the same availability score. So what happens there? So I'm not sure, I'm not very worried about that in principle, because I'm not sure that the kind of cognizers that we are, that's even possible, given all this kind of things that go into this availability thing, like lightning conditions, distances, positioning, colors, brightness, all that stuff. It seems, but of course it's in principle possible, absolutely. So what do I want to say? I want to say, well, when that happens, you're going to have different norms stepping in and deciding where you focus your attention, right? So attention is not only governed by epistemic norms, it's governed by epistemic norms, but also by other norms, right? So, I'm now paying attention to you, not to what's happening behind me, and mainly because we have an interview going on. So there's all kinds of reasons that are not merely epistemic to focus on what we're doing here, professional reasons, moral and prudential reasons, and so on. It would be rather weird if in the middle of the interview I started looking back to see what's happening behind me in the office, just to make sure that I have everything under control. So, when push comes to shove, other norms are, as sad as that might make epistemologists, other norms sometimes step in and tell us where to focus our attention. And those norms are going to thereby decide what goes in our body of evidence. My body of evidence now is different from my children's body of evidence, because I have some other stuff that's available to me. And the reason for that is not epistemic, is professional, right? So I want to say, in cases like this, if they occur, where it's equally easy for you to do 65 plus 13 and to take up what's happening centrally in your visual field, but you can't do both at the same time, the stuff to do is going to have to be the stuff that's practically recommended. And finally, just the final word. In general, I think that the reason why we don't do mathematical stuff in our head, even if it's easily available to us, is just a practical reason. This is not useful. Unfortunately, with sight, we can't choose to do the same thing. So it's our choice to do maths in our head. It's not our choice. It's not my choice now to have all this incoming evidence from perception. So I think there's an important kind of voluntarist difference there, whereby for mathematics, it doesn't just come at me. If you're the type of cognizer I am, it doesn't just populate my thoughts like crazy all the time, in the way in which evidence populates my visual field all the time. So even if it were to be readily available, I think that it would have to at some point override all the stuff that automatically comes from vision, because that is just not under my control. I mean, unless I close my eyes, right? While the mathematical stuff, I just need to go and inquire in my head, as it were. It doesn't flood me itself. Does that kind of answer it satisfactorily for you? I think this is the most important question for the account. Um, yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. And like, because like beyond just this particular case, like I'd want, because the potential trouble is, right, we want to be, the account of evidence resistance to be not so strict or too strong so as to count this case as resistance, but strong enough so that it would count cases like, I don't know, where somebody just isn't considering accessible information relevant to like whether climate change is occurring, that would exclude that from being resistant just because, I don't know, they aren't interested in that or something else like that, or some other pragmatic consideration or professional consideration. We want that to count as resistance, but not this, for example. And like being able to differentiate those on the account is maybe a challenge. But
Yeah. Exactly the challenge. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that intuitively, when we blame people for not, not believing that climate change is happening, these are people that have plenty of evidence. There's no worry there, right? Um, and and those are the cases that we care about diagnosing in that way. There are going to be indeed cases when it's, when you want to say, look, we have this quantitative limitation, so at the end of the day we can't know everything. And when the question is going to be, yeah, sure, but what do we have an obligation to inquire into, right? Or what do we have an epistemic obligation to pay attention to, right? Because one thing that we don't want is to say something like, well, if you're a racist, you can just direct your attention only to the white people. Like that, you're going to fill all your cognitive limitation slot with white people. So then it's okay to think that black people didn't say anything, right? And that's not okay. But that's, on my account, there's not a question of evidence responsiveness. That's a question of a failure in evidence gathering. Just like you shouldn't be biased in evidence responsiveness, whereby you only believe men but not women when they talk to you, you should also not be biased in evidence gathering, whereby you only direct your attention to the white people or to the men. Fill nicely all of your slots in your cognitive limitations, and then all of a sudden, by my theory, you're perfectly fine, because now you're evidence responsive. It's just that your evidence is such that only white people know what they're talking about or whatever. So that's going to be a failure of inquiry, which is something that I discussed briefly in the chapter of suspension, where I say, look, these failures of inquiry have to do with something that is constitutive of the social roles that you have. So very roughly, the thought is, look, when you're a citizen, your social role makes it such that you should inquire into things like climate change, because that's your, as it were, professional obligation as a citizen to know things that affect the well-being of your fellow citizens, right? So you can't be in the clear by just shutting the TV off whenever people talk about climate change, in order to protect yourself from the relevant evidence, and thereby not count as evidence resistant. You're still evidence resistant in the sense in which this is evidence that you should have had because you should have inquired into. But I guess what's important is to make this distinction between a failure of inquiry, where the problem is not one of evidence responsiveness, but it's one of evidence gathering, and a case in which the evidence is literally in front of you and you still reject it, right? So I think that we need to distinguish between these two cases, and we need to distinguish between the norms governing the two activities: updating on evidence versus inquiring into stuff, gathering evidence, because these are two different activities, but they both can affect whether you're justified to believe something or not. So the climate change denier can be unjustified because people are screaming at them that climate change is happening and they refuse to believe it. Or they can be unjustified even though nobody's screaming at them, because they turn off the TV whenever someone tries to scream. And that's because of their failure of evidence gathering.
right, yeah, that seems good. And I did want to bring up, I mean, you talked about fallibilism and infallibilism briefly. I did want to just ask something more about that. So, like, just for the audience, roughly, fallibilists about epistemic justification maintain that we can know some proposition is true, even if our evidence or our justification that in support of that proposition doesn't guarantee that that proposition is true. So our evidence or support is fallible, but still adequate for knowledge in some cases. And I mean, this is a more common view. I think most people in epistemology are fallibilists. There's some intuitive appeal to the idea that I can say no, that it's raining tomorrow, based on like pretty reliable weather reports or weather trends or whatever, even though it's still the evidence that I have is compatible with it not raining tomorrow. But yeah, I mean, this as you talk about, this is potentially in tension with certain kind of knowledge centric understandings of evidence, and you refer kind of So what would you make of
Yeah, so just as you said earlier, there are bits of my account that people can take on even without taking on some other bits. So in particular, as I said, I never defended the view that basically justified belief and knowledge requires evidential probability. One, this is a view that Tim holds and that I like. I have some reason to like it, but it's a bit far afield, so I'm not going to go into that. But the point is that you don't need to have that view in order to like my framework. You can have less, you can be a fallibilist, you can think that you can have a lower threshold. That being said, I think that, to be honest with you, I think that people like fallibilists for the wrong reasons. So I like fallibilists for a long time. And here are the reasons why I liked it. And if people are like me, they're the wrong reasons. I liked it because I thought, look, intuitively, testimony gives us less support than perception, right? So even if you're someone who doesn't require Cartesian certainty for epistemic probability one, you might think that perception gives you epistemic probability one, but testimony doesn't, right? So that's a reason. But of course, you don't want to say that you can't come to know from testimony, because that's a pretty ridiculous form of skepticism. I mean, most of our knowledge comes from testimony and very, very little comes from perception. So if you're a skeptic about testimony, you're a skeptic simpliciter. So you don't want to have that view. So basically, if you accept the following two principles, one, perception and testimony give you different levels of support. In particular, it's always the case that perception gives you more than testimony. Then you're going to have to, and testimony gives you knowledge, you're going to have to accept that testimony is lower than one, that knowledge is lower than one, right? And I think that's what motivated me for the longest time to believe this. And what you said sounded a bit like that, right? Because you said, look, I have this reliable weather reports. I can come to know it's going to rain tomorrow. I want to say, yes, in Glasgow. In other places, I don't know that the weather reports are enough. But I think in Glasgow you can. So here is something that I've become convinced by working in the epistemology of testimony, that the intuition that testimony is less good of a source than perception is mistaken. So I've become convinced that we think that because often we imagine these horrifying scenarios where people are going to lie to us, and they can lie to us if it suits them. And often our interests don't align with their interests, so they're probably going to lie. But that is actually a scenario that's very far from the actual scenario. So the actual scenario that we live in is that we very often don't have any defeaters to people's testimony. I ask someone in the street, where is Glasgow Central Station? They're going to tell me where is Glasgow Central Station. And you know what? That's where Glasgow Central Station is going to end up being. So that's our normal kind of situation. And that's why we have so many testimonial beliefs that amount to knowledge. If testimony were to be an unsafe source, we couldn't have so much testimonial knowledge, because unsafe sources don't give knowledge, right? Knowledge implies some variety of safety. So it's got to be that actual testimony is a very safe source of knowledge, since we have so much knowledge from it. So basically, in a nutshell, what I want to say is, it's not clear to me that it's correct that testimony gives you less than perception. So if that's not correct, we're not left with a lot of reasons to be fallibilists, basically. Because again, the reason to be fallibilist in the kind of contemporary sense of fallibilism versus infallibilism, nobody's an infallibilist in the Cartesian sense, right? So nobody thinks that in order to have knowledge, you need evidential probability one, and evidential probability one is Cartesian certainty. Nobody believes that. Nobody's crazy, right? And also on linguistic grounds, you shouldn't believe that. Why do we have different words for certainty and knowledge? Because they're two different categories, right? I mean, otherwise why bother to have different words for them? We can have a simpler conceptual life. So my thinking is, if you're not a Cartesian certainty person about evidential probability one, if you're thinking that evidential probability one is roughly the kind of stuff that perception gives me, so I think I have evidential probability one, that there's a laptop here right now. So if that's what you think evidential probability one is, it's not that implausible that you get from testimony as well. In which case, this intuitive difference that's been advocated between testimony and perception is actually wrong-headed. There is no difference there when you look at things closer. And it is a funny thing, I think. Our students, in my experience, start off by being skeptics about testimony. Many times they say things like, we don't have any knowledge. We need to go check ourselves. People can lie. And as they learn more about counterexamples to this claim, so when I come and point out, well, look, actually, the vast majority of things that you know from your teachers in school and the Discovery Channel and the news, did you check all the sources really carefully yourself? Then that's when, people are like, oh, okay, then, yeah, actually, as a matter of fact, I either know very few things or testimony gives me quite a bit of epistemic support without any detective work. So that's what I'm saying. As soon as this kind of theoretical considerations step in, I think the pool of fallibilism, if it is motivated by this alleged difference between testimonial and perceptual support, I think it starts vanishing a little.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's other ways we might motivate. I mean, here's another consideration. I don't want to dwell on this because it's not really super central to your account, but but just one quick one. Like, we might think that we have a sort of second order undercutting defeater for testimony as a source because we know that it's not perfectly reliable. So that should at least be somewhat of an undercutter. Maybe not significant, but wouldn't it reasonably lower our confidence in something derived by testimony less than one, if that makes sense?
So I think that's all compatible with infallibilism. So here's a picture that's completely compatible. We all think that testifiers can lie to us, and I think mistakenly, judging by the studies, the social studies that I've seen, we also think that happens a lot. It turns out people don't lie. Very rarely do people lie. At least that's what studies suggest. But it doesn't matter what studies say. What matters is what we believe they say. And it turns out that we believe that people lie all the time, which is false. So maybe we think, okay, people lie all the time, or at least even if they don't lie all the time, they can lie. So that possibility is always a very close possibility, right? So thereby we have the standing defeater to information coming from testimony, which we don't have from information coming from perception. Not because our perceptual field can't be tampered with, because of course maybe everything is fake around here. I'm not in my office now. I came to a colleague's office because they have better internet. So for all I know, he just set up an entire fake barn scenario in this office, and all the beliefs that I'm forming about my visual field are all false. But that happens rarely, right? So maybe the way we think is in perception, very rarely am I deceived. While in testimony, it happens all the time. So I have a standing defeater for testimony that I don't have for perception. I want to say, well, if that's the case, whenever the standing defeater is standing, you don't know. Of course, in many cases, this standing defeater itself is defeated, right? So even if I harbor this skeptical doubts about testimony in general, I'm still going to believe when my colleague Adam tells me that he's coming to the office at 9. Why? Because I have defeaters when it comes to Adam. I know that he's a reliable guy, even if people in general are not. Adam is, right? So if in this kind of scenario, if that's what's going on, I want to say, well, that means that we only get knowledge from testifiers in cases in which the standing defeater is defeated. We get knowledge from our teachers in school. Why? Well, we know they're paid to tell the truth, and that if they lie, there's our institutional kind of ways for them to be punished and whatever, made to tell the truth, as it were. So maybe that's why we have defeater to testimony in general, but a defeater coming from the institutional framework when it comes to trusting our teachers. Similarly with Discovery Channel, there are institutions that make sure that we don't get on this kind of very mainstream channels a lot of this misinformation, right? And I want to say, well, if that's what's going on, that's fine. That because you can still say, look, knowledge is probability 1, and you get it from both perception and testimony. But in the case of testimony, you only get it when your standing defeater is itself defeated. So you get it from your teachers, you get it from Discovery Channel and from your close friends. You don't get it from other people where the standing defeater is not defeated by anything, right? So it's still going to be an okay view because it's still going to predict that we have most of the knowledge that we take ourselves to have, because most of it is going to be from this kind of sources where the defeater is defeated. It's going to be a bit of a funny view in that it's going to predict that you don't know what this testifier tells you in the street about where the central station is. Unless you have a standing defeater that says people don't often lie about this stuff that they don't care about, like, for instance, where the central station is. So I think that you can still be an infallibilist, even if you're right about the standing defeater, by saying, yeah, and you only get knowledge when it's defeated.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess that makes sense. I mean, there's still some problems that I would have. Like, how do you even get to probability one in the first place? Like, if we're just doing good Bayesian updating, like, isn't that not even? Isn't it even like not even possible to get probability one from starting from a lower than one probability and updating appropriately?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a formal epistemologist, but it is, so here's a simple way to do it non-formally. If I get probability one from you, then P, and I get probability one from Adam, that Q, and Q and P imply R, then I have probability one for R. So that's a nice way to go about it, right? So similarly, you can think about induction in a very similar sense, in a very similar way. If what I get from induction is all probability one, right? So everything that I plug into my induction thing is probability one. I don't get risk agglomeration, so I don't have that problem. My conjunction is going to be not going to have a lower probability than the conjuncts because I don't get a risk agglomeration and so on. So, in a way, in a very unfair way, and I'm going to admit that, being a probability one person makes life easier, if anything, for accounting for all of this stuff. But again, I haven't defended the view itself. I have some thoughts about new ways to defend it because I thought that Tim did a good job defending it. I'm convinced. This is one bit of Tim's work that I haven't worked on myself because I didn't feel like I have new things to say. But if I ever do, I might get on with it. I mean, one reason to think that this probability one thing is not that crazy has actually to do with testimony, right? So basically, the thought, very roughly, I'm not going to do the entire argument, but the thought is that if you imagine a lottery with very, very many testifiers, right? So it's not a lottery with tickets; it's a lottery with testifiers. You very, very quickly are going to have to be either a probability one person or to say something very funny about testimony, right? Because so imagine a case where you have a million testifiers telling you this ticket won, this ticket won, no, this ticket lost, this ticket lost. So all the 1 million tell you this ticket lost, right? But you know that someone is lying because one ticket won, right? So now it looks as though, so now make this lottery as big as you want, right? The question is, it looks as though now that you find out that one ticket did win, it looks as though you should lower your confidence, whatever your confidence was from what this testifier said. You should lower it now, right? And the question is, well, now if you increase this lottery really, really, you make it really, really big, it would look as though there's going to come a point where, unless it's one, this decrease, the question is going to be, where do you decrease this confidence from, right? Because as you increase this lottery, the confidence that you should have gets pretty close to one, right? So when you decrease it, the question is, where are you decreasing it from, if not from one itself? Now, this is not a knockdown argument, but these are kind of the kind of reasons that get me to think that there's not such a crazy thing to think.
Yeah, there's definitely stuff there. I mean, I'm sort of perfectly fine with agglomeration and just accepting, preface paradox. Yeah, I think I should reject the conjunction even if I have a good reason to accept all the conjuncts and so on. But I can see there's some reason to think the other way. And of course, as you say, I think in principle, pretty much everything you say here could be accommodated on either view.
Yeah, so I'm not committed to probability one in anything that I say. I think that the only thing that I'm committed to, because I spell out evidence in terms of being in a position to know, it's a knowledge-centric account. So I'm going to be committing to a bunch of the things that the evidence is knowledge view commits one to. So in that sense, it's going to be an infallibilist view of evidence, and that is spelled out in terms of knowledge. But I think that I don't mind that much, basically. So I think that every defense that Tim has done to his account is I can just import it for free, basically, without the problems.
Fair enough. All right. So before we wrap up, I did want to ask a question. Something else you raise in this book, as you've raised elsewhere, is on your account or your approach to information versus disinformation, and how you prefer somewhat a factive account, and then how you kind of go against some of the orthodoxy in characterizing these things. So I don't know if you want to talk briefly about your approach there. And
Yeah, so the study of information is very strange in that it mostly hasn't been done in epistemology, and that is just a strange thing in itself, right? Because you think that if anybody has, the specialist to work on this is going to be epistemologists, and that we are wasting a lot of time by having, a separate field that's called philosophy of information, because whoever works in that field is not going to benefit from the resources that we already developed over thousands of years in epistemology, right? So I've always found this very strange. But that being said, Dretske very notably cared about information, and that's what drew me. The thing is, when a field is not really approached by people in your field, you are not very drawn to approaching it either, because you don't have proper interlocutors, right? I'm sorry to say, but most people who work in the philosophy of information, I don't have much to talk to, because they don't say very interesting things. They say things that are not very epistemologically informed, and I, don't care about teaching them epistemology. But Dretske did, and Dretske was a very, very clever guy. And so that made it exciting for me to look a bit at this. And my thinking is that, because many people weren't epistemologists, not even philosophers of language or anything like that, they made some mistakes about information in general. Some people think it's not factive because they don't understand how privative language works. So people think things like, well, if we can say something like fake information, it follows that we can have false stuff that is information. It's a species. Fake information is a species of information. Therefore, information doesn't need to be factive. It can be false as well. And this is just a mistake. People don't understand privative modifiers. Some modifiers don't signal species type relations, right? When I say my former husband, he's not a husband of mine. To the contrary, I'm saying that he's not my husband anymore. When I say fake gold is not a species of gold. To the contrary, it's a privative modifier. It signals that it's not gold, right? Similarly, disbarring is not a form of being a member of the bar. So why should we think that disinformation is a species of information? So all kinds of linguistic data that were just misunderstood in this field led people to think very crazy things about the nature of information, such as, for instance, that it's not factive. So this is a new thing that I'm working on. My first piece is this piece on disinformation that's in the book, where I argue for a knowledge way of understanding it, in that the traditional definition as false or misleading content that is spread with the intention to deceive doesn't work, is too restrictive. You can disinform people with true content by, for instance, false implicatures, and you can disinform people without intending to do so by mistake. We can do anything. For all phi, you can do phi by mistake. So it's the same with disinformation. So what the account that I'm putting forth is an account in terms of ignorance generating, because basically what I argue for is that the only thing that instances of disinformation have in common is that they have a disposition to generate ignorance in that particular context. They can do so via false content. They can do so via true content with false implicatures. They can do that via true content that constitutes a misleading defeater for an extant body of evidence. And now, I tell you this true content bit, you lower your confidence in this other random proposition here that you had evidence for, because this content defeats your evidence here. So you end up being less knowledgeable because now you decreased your ignorance in this other proposition. So the point is, very roughly, look, there are many ways of disinforming people. We have all these strategies that we know of, from the history of propaganda. All these strategies, the best of them, don't use false content. Indeed, using false content is kind of an idiotic and simplistic way of trying to disinform people. So if we want to track it, we need to have a correct account of it. And the correct account is in terms of ignorance generating. That's what's wrong with it, that it has a disposition to generate ignorance. And the neat things about this account is that it fits neatly with my entire view of evidence resistance. Why did I need this account in the book? Because, as I said, we need to distinguish between evidence resistance and mere evidence rejection. When someone comes on TV and says there's disagreement in science about climate change, it is perfectly justified for some audiences to disbelieve that climate change is happening at that stage. How is that? Well, strictly speaking, what was said was true. There is disagreement in science about climate change, very minor amounts of disagreement, a couple of crazy people somewhere in Texas, probably. But the point is that it's true. It's a true assertion. There is disagreement in science. But here is what the audience understands: the audience understands the amount of disagreement is salient and relevant enough that is newsworthy, because this is asserted in the context of news. So what the audience justifiably ends up believing is that there's so much disagreement that it was okay for it to be on the news. That's how much disagreement there is, that it made the news. And if that's the case, people should suspend. If that's the content that is communicated, there's so much disagreement that it made the news, then the reaction is, well, let's suspend until these people figure out what the situation is. So in that case, the account is going to predict these people are rejecting evidence of climate change justifiably because they've been disinformed. Their epistemic environment is polluted with misleading defeaters to their beliefs based on scientific expertise, right? So that I needed this account of this information. I need to have an account to begin with in order to explain how it can happen that the cognizer is the victim of a bad epistemic environment and ends up rejecting perfectly fine scientific evidence in virtue of this information.
Good. Yeah, I was wondering. For disinformation, like if somebody's already completely ignorant, or on some issue, suppose they know nothing about, I don't know, climate scientists or the whatever, and then somebody tells them something about how, they say something false about climate science that we would normally count as disinformation. But it's not making them more ignorant, presumably, because they already were ignorant. So, I mean,
Yeah, the account predict. So here is why: because when it comes to generating ignorance, actually the precise formulation of the account is generating or increasing ignorance. And then the way I spell it out is in terms of these evidential probabilities that I use in the rest of my account as well in order to unify it. So what I'm saying is that you are rendered more ignorant when your evidential probabilities are affected, even if your beliefs are not. So here's, for instance, a case. Say that it's a case in which you have 5 pieces of evidence on your desk that Mary committed the murder. Uh, and you haven't yet formed a belief. You're still looking at these pieces of evidence and evaluating them, right? If I come and I take 2 pieces of evidence from you, I will have generated ignorance in you by the relevant way of using ignorance generating for this account. And why is that important? Because often that's how it happens, especially in these vulnerable communities. So you have people don't know what to believe. The NHS comes and tells them vaccines are safe. They're still wondering, what should I believe? And then you have this misinformation coming and defeating the evidence from the NHS, coming and saying, don't believe the NHS. They're trying to put chips in your shoulder or whatever, the 5G and so on. So this information doesn't act on anybody's beliefs because these people are already kind of not knowing what to believe. But it acts by coming and stealing the evidence that they have by defeating it, right? So it's exactly like me stealing the evidence of the murder from your desk. So the account accommodates that. So it's, in a way, it's a misnomer that I call it in terms of ignorance generating, because it's broader than that. So it counts as generating ignorance even in cases in which you don't yet have any belief. It just kind of steals evidence from you. And the reason why I think that, very roughly, is because I think that I think of this generating ignorance as having to do with increasing the distance from you to knowledge. So you're more ignorance is generating on you when the distance from you to knowledge becomes wider, becomes bigger, right? So and then it makes sense, right? If it's in terms of closeness to knowledge, it makes sense that now that I've stolen some perfectly fine evidence from you by defeating it, then you're now further away from knowledge than you used to be. And the distance to knowledge thing, is not unpacked, but feel free to, think of it as just a possible worlds type of thing. How close is the world when you're going to come to know? Well, now that I've defeated the perfectly fine evidence that you had from the NHS, the world when you come to know the vaccines are safe is further away. So I increased your distance from knowledge. Therefore, I made your distance to ignorance closer. So in that sense, I increase your ignorance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so like, even if you're already quite ignorant of some matter in the first place, you might, some information or disinformation might make you even further away from coming to the truth on this matter, because, I don't know, it's leading you astray in some respect. So it's
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
okay, that makes sense.
you're ignorant in the sense in which you haven't yet formed a belief, but you have some material to form it, and stealing some of that material away by a defeat is making you more ignorant, because it's going to be harder for you to form the correct belief now that you're left without material.
But even for the person who has little or nothing in terms of material to go on already, like I
Yeah.
could imagine, maybe some young child maybe that doesn't just never heard of these issues. It's not, maybe we're not defeating something they already had, but like if we are pushing their credence in some climate change thesis like further away from the truth, and maybe that's still a sense of them becoming more ignorant, and that it's hard to come to knowledge on that, or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, basically, if you are someone who has no view on it, and someone comes and lies to you about this, what you're going to do is, if you're a rational cognizer, you're going to increase your confidence in the falsehood. So that all of a sudden puts you further away from knowledge. And even if you're not a rational cognizer, just the fact that you now have the evidence that warrants you to form this higher confidence or false belief, it puts you further away from knowledge, right? So basically, it's easy to think of it. That's why I mentioned this closest to knowledge thing. As soon as you think about the distant, how distant is the world where I come to know that climate change is happening? Well, now that I don't know anything, it's pretty distant. But not if someone comes and tells me that it's not happening, now it's further away, right? Because now I have some level of confidence, or even a belief that it's not happening. So that's going to be harder for me to go all the way back. So yeah, that's why I mentioned this distance thing. I don't like to talk about it much because I haven't yet spelled it out. So I don't have a very precise thing. That's why I always say just think about it in terms of worlds. And it may well be that at the end of the day we can't say more about closeness to knowledge than worlds, because in a way a precise unpacking on closeness to knowledge might imply an imprecise unpacking of what knowledge is, and that we know is hard to do, and some of us don't really want to attempt it. So, but I think it's a useful theoretical device just to figure out what the account says.
All right, good. Yeah, so I normally end these interviews with a kind of general metaphilosophical question about the value of philosophy. I don't know if you want to answer that, or maybe just think about the value of thinking about epistemology, or the sort of stuff you work on, the kind of value and upshot of that, or philosophy more generally. I don't know how you want to take that, but
Yeah, about so I think philosophy is much more valuable than even philosophers take it to be. I think of philosophy as just being, on a continuum with any other field, in that we're trying to figure out what is the case and what isn't. Figuring out what is the case is a valuable enterprise. What is the case in the abstract often has extremely serious consequences for what is the case in the practical. And indeed, not theorizing about the abstract, only theorizing about the practical, very often leads us astray, because we don't understand basically the limits of a phenomenon, right? So if you're not a philosopher, the way in which you do work is you start with paradigmatic instances of a phenomenon, and you work and you analyze those paradigmatic instances of this phenomenon. But what is important is to have the correct account of what the phenomenon is, and the correct account is not going to be just what the paradigmatic instance is, and that requires a lot of abstract work that needs to be done in philosophy. So in my view, there's nothing really special about the value of philosophy. In a way, I find it even peculiar to answer this question, because it's like answering the question, what's the value of physics, or what's the value of chemistry? Well, it's about finding out stuff about physical stuff and chemical stuff, and in the case of philosophy, about whatever we're talking about. In my case, finding out stuff about evidence and defeat and justification. And these are important things. I mean, we started off by saying that this entire philosophical book, which is quite boring and abstract at the end of it, was motivated by a very serious social phenomenon. So many people, when they see the title, I think I lured in by the thought, oh, this is going to be exciting. It's going to be a lot about what's happening de facto in society. It's not a lot about that. But if we don't get the theory right, we can't really analyze what's happening in society that well, because we're missing distinctions that we need to make. And if we're missing distinctions, we don't know how to address phenomena in the real world. So I guess, what's the value of physics? Well, there's stuff in the world whereby we need to understand. And for that, we need to do some physical theorizing. And similarly with philosophy. I'm not going to lie. Mostly when you're trained as a philosopher, that's not what brings you to it. So you're not coming to, epistemology in order to solve the infodemic. And you shouldn't, right? Because you should be someone who's extremely passionate about abstract work if you are to do this abstract work well. We want specialists to do the abstract work, right? So we need someone that actually likes to do this kind of stuff. So you shouldn't be actually the kind of person who cares about the infodemic. And if you care too much about that, you might not be very good at the abstract, because you might not care enough about the abstract. But compatibly, we really can't solve the infodemic without figuring out the epistemological underpinnings. So I guess, I find the question of the value of philosophy always a question that somehow presupposes some sort of special status of philosophy, maybe sometimes in the positive and sometimes in the negative. And I do think it has this special status in either the positive or the negative. I think it's just a field like all the other fields, that needs to be done well, and that we need to train people to do it well. And since it's a very abstract field, it needs to be done, in the abstract. And then we need to train specialists that they can take these abstract results and apply them in the real world, just like we do with any other field, right? In physics, we have very theoretical physics and then very applied stuff.
Yeah, I can't really agree more. I like that approach a lot. So yeah, I mean, thanks so much for.
I think especially this was really fun. I really had a lot of fun, and I'm very happy that we didn't get interrupted, because that was quite frustrating. And I can imagine how bad it would have been, given how exciting the discussion was, if all of a sudden, once in a while in the middle, we would have been cut off. So that's great. Thanks a lot for having me. This was really fun.